The Philippine National Philosophical Research Society, or PNPRS, is a society of philosophy professors and students whose advocacy is to make philosophy an essential instrument and academic discipline in nation building and world understanding. PNPRS recognizes loyalty to philosophy and the nation. It promotes philosophical research and publication through its internationally indexed journal, Filosofiya, International Journal of Philosophy, which publishes articles that present all types of philosophical views. PNPRS is a venue for philosophical inquiry and academic exchange of ideas to form not just scholars but also world-class philosophers. Let us strengthen Filipino philosophy across borders and make philosophy a catalyst for nation building. Join us!
Ikaw ba si Juan o si Marites na madalas na nakatambay sa social networking sites? Ikaw ba si Juan o si Marites na hindi pa sigurado kung sino-sino ang pipiliin sa paparating na halalan? Ikaw ba si Juan o si Marites na nais malaman kung paano pumili ng iboboto sa papalapit na halalan? Kung isa ka sa mga ito, panahon na upang i-like at i-follow ang Isip Boto Mandato social media accounts dahil siguradong marami kang matututuhan at malalaman mula rito. Sa Isip Boto, tayo ay hihikayating manindigan at magnilay bago bumoto. Dito nagmula ang katagang mandato, isang mahalagang salitang nagpapahiwatig ng tungkulin natin ngayong panahon ng halalan. Kaya Isip Boto, mandato. Ano ba ang Isip Boto? Ito ay isang voters education program na nagnanais magbahagi ng mga pamantayang moral sa pagpili ng mga pinuno sa nalalapit na halalan. Nais din itong palawigin ang responsableng pagpili sa pamamagitan ng pagtuklas ng local knowledge and practices ng mga lokal na komunidad sa bansa. Dahil mahalaga ang halalan para sa sambayanan at sa ating kinabukasan, mahalaga ang pagtutulungan para sa responsableng pagtugon sa ating mandato bilang mamamayang Pilipino. Kaya Isip Boto, mandato. Ano nga ba ang layunin ng Isip Boto? Una, layunin ng Isip Boto na ipaalam sa publiko ang kahalagahan ng estado at suliranin na may kaugnayan sa halalan. Pangalawa, layunin ding ituro nito ang halaga ng halalan bilang instrumento sa pagpapatibay ng kalayaan at demokrasya. At ang ikatlo, layunin nitong hikayatin ang publiko tungo sa responsableng pagboto. Kaya Isip Boto, mandato. Ang Isip Boto ay proyekto ng Philosophical Association of the Philippines, katuwang ang ilan sa mga institusyon at professional organizations, kagaya ng Philippine Sociological Society, Philippine National Philosophical Research Society, Pambansang Samahan ng Psikolohiyang Pilipino, Lasal Institute of Governance, Union Societies of Associations of Philosophy in the Philippines, Siliman University School of Public Affairs and Governance, at St. Louis University's Department of Political and Social Sciences. Ikaw, oo ikaw, pwede ring maging bahagi nito. Kaya Isip Boto, mandato. Mahalaga ang tungkulin ng bawat Pilipino ngayong halalan. Kaya naman huwag sayangin ang pagkakataong mas matuto tungkol sa halalan sa mga serbisyong handog ng Isip Boto. Kaya kung ikaw si Juan o si Marites o isang Pilipino, babae, lalaki, LGBTQ+, indigenous o kahit saan ka man na naniniwalang dapat manindigan ngayong halalan, i-like o i-follow mo na ang aming social media accounts. Pagsikapan nating matuto ang lahat na manindigan at magnilay bago bumoto. Kaya Isip Boto, mandato.
The Philippine National Philosophical Research Society, or PNPRS, is a society of philosophy professors and students whose advocacy is to make philosophy an essential instrument and academic discipline in nation building and world understanding. PNPRS recognizes loyalty to philosophy and the nation. It promotes philosophical research and publication through its internationally indexed journal, Philosophia, International Journal of Philosophy, which publishes articles that present all types of philosophical views. PNPRS is a venue for philosophical inquiry and academic exchange of ideas to form not just scholars but also world-class philosophers. Let us strengthen Filipino philosophy across borders and make philosophy a catalyst for nation building. Join us!
Hello, good afternoon, friends in philosophy, and welcome to the online lecture of public lecture of uh, Dr. Teehankee and Miss Ash Presto, uh, hosted by the Philippine National Philosophical Research Society in partnership with Isip Boto. And we welcome you, friends, those who are watching live right now in Facebook Live and at YouTube to this online lecture. To start off our day, may I call on Miss Maria Glove D. Joy L. Bigornia, our PNPRS Legal Officer, to start our day with prayer.
Manalangin po tayo. Let us pray. God our Father, grant me due respect for the abilities you have given me. Don't let me bury my talents through indecision, cowardice, or laziness. Plant in me the necessary determination. Rouse in me the fires of dedication. Give me the energy, strength, and willpower to bring your gifts to their proper completion. When I falter or fall, lift me up and set me back on my destined path. O God, when the way seems dark and there's no light there, plant at least one small signal fire at the end of the long black tunnel, that I may keep plodding steadily forward toward it. When friends laugh at me, when people tempt me away from it, when others scorn what I have produced, let me not be discouraged. When those who have tried and failed, or who have never tried at all, those who are envious or indolent, when such people would hurt me by spiteful words or acts, let me not be bothered. Return me to my task. Let nothing really matter but these precious gifts you have entrusted to me. For their sake, let me be willing and proud to make the humble sacrifice. Dear Lord, as we begin our afternoon session, may you guide and enlighten us with your knowledge and wisdom on certain topics that are essential for the empowerment of human choice and for the improvement of our social and political relations with others, as we listen ardently to the right person for the right reason in a right way, so that the goodness and blessings which you've shared with us be more productive and awe inspiring to others. Amen.
Maraming salamat, Ms. Bigornia, para sa ating panimulang pagbati mula sa ating PNPRS Secretary na si Dr. Jeffrey L. Bartlett.
Magandang hapon sa inyong lahat. Sa mga resource persons natin na inibitahan ngayong hapon, Dr. Teehankee, Ma'am Presto at si Father Alejo, magandang hapon po sa inyo. Sa mga conveners po ng Isip Boto, sa mga kasama kong officers ng PNPRS, at sa lahat po ng participants natin na galing sa iba't ibang sektor mula sa Mindanao, sa Visayas at Luzon, magandang hapon. Paano nga ba natin bubuksan ng isang bagay na sadya ng bukas at magbubukas pa sa atin sa maraming bagay? Tayo na nagtitipon-tipon ngayon, tayo na magkakakilala sa maiksing panahon sa virtual na lugar na ito, tayo na nagsasalo-salo, nagninilay, nagmumuni, at marahil nagkakasiyahan kahit sandali. Paano nga ba natin bubuksan kung ang pagtitipon na ito ay sa umpisa pa lang ay umpisa pa lang ng maraming bagay? Mga bagay na ating haharapin at mga pwedeng gawin at pagsumikapan. O baka naman ako ay nagkakamali nang sinabi ko na umpisa pa lang ito. Nadatnan na natin ang ating sarili sa gitna ng mga bagay. At dahil tayo'y nasa gitna na ng mga bagay-bagay, nalalaman ko rin ng aking kasama na naririto, kayo, ay nakaugnay na sa akin. Nakasangkot na sa mga pangyayari na ating nararanasan. Nakabigkis na tayo. At kung ako ay nakakaramdam ng hirap, ng sakit, ng pagkainis, ng galit, ng inhustisya, ay malamang ay gayon din kayo. Ano nga ba ang aking pinupunto? Marami sa atin ang may maling paniniwala na ang filosofiya at pamimilosopiya ay pawang teorya lamang, na wala itong kaugnayan sa ating nararanasan araw-araw. Kung kaya't hinihiwalay nila ang isip, ang pag-iisip, ang pagmumuni at pagninilay sa kilos at pagkilos, na tila baga maaari nating hatiin ang mundo. Nahiwalay ang aking isip sa aking katawan, sa aking nararanasan at nararamdaman. Sa aking palagay, mali ang ganitong pagtingin. Ito ay mga artipisyal lamang na hangganan na gawa-gawa ng ilang tao, katulad ng mga nais mapanatili ang kasalukuyang kaayusan. Ang mga pagtitipong gaya nito ay isang pagkakataon na ipinapakita na nagtatalaban ang mga karanasan, ang mga natutunan, ang mga isipan at ideya, at na kakalampas sa mga hangganan ng edad, ng talino, ng pagkakasakit, ng uri o klas. At dito na rin natin makikita ang lakas at potensyal ng anumang ugnayan, na katulad ng ating katawan ay maaring bumuo, maaring kumilos, at maaring malampasan ang idiniktang artipisyal na hangganan. Bagamat isa lamang ito sa ating mga politikal na opsyon, itong eleksyon na darating, marapat pa rin na hindi dapat mawala sa ating paningin ang makamit ang ating hangarin, ang pagnanais ng kaligayahan at kaginhawahan para sa lahat. Well-being for all, ika nga, sabi ni Peter Kropotkin. Kaya't sa hapong ito, inaanyahan kayo ng PNPRS, ng Isip Boto, upang pakinggan ang ating mga kapanayam at magtulungan at magsumikap para sa tamang pagpili. Maraming salamat at magandang hapon.
Yan, salamat po Sir Jeff for a very engaging panimulang pagbati. Without further ado, now let us proceed to one of the main highlights of today's program. So to introduce our speaker and moderate the Q&A, may I call my co-MC, Sir Joseph Guillermo. Sir Joseph?
Maraming salamat, Ma'am Glove. Yung ating bisita ngayon, ang ating unang sasalita ay isa sa mga importanteng public intellectual ng ating bansa. Si Dr. Julio Teehankee ay Professor of Political Science and International Studies sa De La Salle de Manila University, kung saan siya nagsilbi bilang Chair of the Political Science Department, Chair of the International Studies Department, and Dean of the College of Liberal Arts. Siya rin ay nanungkulan bilang presidente ng Philippine Political Science Association and the Asian Political and International Studies Association. Siya rin ay ang representative ng Pilipinas sa Council of the International Political Science Association. Siya rin ay Regional Manager of the Varieties of Democracy or VDEM for Southeast Asia and the Pacific at isang founding fellow of the DLSU Southeast Asia Research Center and Hub or DLSU Search. Noong 2020, siya ay naging Distinguished Visiting Research Scholar sa Center for Southeast Asian Studies sa Kyoto University, Japan. Siya rin ay lumalabas rin bilang political analyst sa local at international media outlets at meron rin siyang YouTube video channel na tinatawag na Talk Politics with Julio Teehankee. Ating i-welcome si Dr. Teehankee ngayong hapon para makinig sa kanyang talk, The Theories of Patronage and the Myth of the Bobotante.
Thank you very much, Joseph. Magandang hapon. Good afternoon to all. I would like to thank the organizers of this event, the Philippine National Philosophical Research Society, for inviting me to speak this afternoon. It's election season once again, and a number of Filipinos are anxious about the potential outcome of this year's political exercise. The reality is that while there is a clamor for more debates and presidential interviews, it is assumed that only a minority who are educated from the upper and middle classes are the ones interested in these exercises. The majority from the poor are deemed irrational, and they consist 94% of Filipino voters. In recent years, there has been a rise in the discourse of the so-called Bobotante, particularly in social media. Bobotantes, a term for uneducated and irrational, and more often than not referred to poor voters, are sometimes blamed for bad election outcomes by people who believe that a competent leader should have been chosen instead. To be found in Twitter, in Facebook, Viber, and other social media outlets, I've seen a lot of these memes and even messages and postings, even among my high school batch Viber group, composed of the typical konyo kids and sigas of my youth who are now politically active titos. So, my talk for this afternoon would like to address three questions. No? What accounts for the voting behavior of the poor? Second, are there really Bobotante voters? And third, what are the implications of these for elections? Now, central to addressing these questions is the concept of patronage. Patronage refers to a divisible benefit that politicians distribute to individual voters, campaign workers, or contributors in exchange for political support. Now, patronage is different from corruption, since corrupt politicians exchange public benefits for private monetary gains. On the other hand, patronage involves the exchange of public benefits for political support or party advantage. And I would like to take this opportunity to plug the upcoming book I co-edited with Cleo Kalimbahin, Patronage Democracy in the Philippines, Clans, Clients, and Competitions in Local Elections, to be published by the Ateneo de Manila University Press. It's coming out at the end of this February. Now, I would like to walk you through the structural theories of patronage in the Philippines. The standard approach to analyzing Filipino electoral and party politics has been to view power relations within the context of the so-called patron-client factional framework, or the PCF framework. Popularized in the 1960s by Karl Lande, from the patron-client framework posited that social relations in the Philippines is not structured by organized interest groups or individuals who perceive themselves to be part of a specific social class, just like in Western democracies. What exists in the Philippines is a network of mutual aid relationships between pair of individuals that he called dyadic ties. The dyadic ties that are reflected in Philippine politics are vertical and unequal, which bind prosperous patrons who dispense material goods and services, and dependent clients who reciprocate with their support and loyalty. Now, the classic patron-client ties were common in the past when the economy was largely agricultural. This approach has been heavily criticized in recent years as being overly simplistic, untextured, ahistorical, or even static. Nonetheless, the PCF model tends to reify, if not valorize, reciprocity, smooth interpersonal relationship, kinship, and fictive kinship bonds normally forged within rural and peasant-based economies. And some would even point to the big part of cultural factors in cementing this patron-client ties. Now, another enduring structural view of patronage in the Philippines is Marxism. From the local Marxist perspective, Philippine society is semi-feudal and semi-colonial. The Philippine economy is still primarily agricultural, dominated by the persistence of feudal relations of production. And for Marxism, feudalism is the social base of imperialism. Imperialism and feudalism have prevented industrialization and the development of capitalism. Hence, the path towards liberation is national democratic revolution led by an alliance of the workers, peasants, the nationalist bourgeoisie, and allied classes that will usher a transitional stage towards socialism. Now, this message of the Marxists remains relevant up to this day. For as long as there are mass poverty and gross social inequality, Marxism will remain to be an alternative for most Filipinos. Just like that famous song originally sung by the group Buklod, led by Noel Cabangon in 1989, and later on remade by Bamboo. No? Habang may tatsulok at sila ang nasa tuktok, di matatapos itong bulok. However, this version of Marxism-Leninism, coupled with Jose Maria Sison's interpretation of Maoism, has been criticized, no, as being a dogmatic application of the Maoist doctrine. And it failed to take into account changes in Philippine political economy in the past decades. Another criticism about this interpretation of Marxism in the Philippines is that it takes a very reductionist interpretation of Philippine politics. The other alternatives are the following. The potency of the kingship system as an instrument of patronage was primarily believed to have diminished and replaced in recent years by the emergence of the political machine. The onslaught of economic transformation and modernity has largely depersonalized patron relations in the rural areas. Thus, the reciprocal relationship between leader and followers have become transactional. Political machines are specialized organizations set up to mobilize and influence voter outcomes through the dispensation of social, economic, or material benefits. Whereas in the past, the patron-client relationship was based on rural and sometimes, and more often than not, feudal relationship. In the machine politics stage of patronage, uh, it is largely transactional and based on the mutual exchange of benefits. And these benefits include jobs, services, favors, and money, and nowadays ayuda, no, distributed to voters and supporters. No? In the traditional local parlance, it is called the KBL, the Kasal, Binyag, Libing Functions of Local Politics. Now, political machines may be organized within or outside political parties. Parties that adopt a patronage strategy and rely heavily upon distribution of patronage to mobilize support may or may not be extensively organized and highly centralized. Moreover, political machines do not need dyadic personal relationships since it is based on short-term materialistic benefits. For Francisco Magno, the rise of political machines as the primary expression of patronage politics was a result of the breakdown of the reciprocal and interpersonal system of exchange and was further facilitated by the rise of new social forces like the working class, the urban poor, and the middle class that cannot be subsumed solely within narrow patron-client loyalties. An opposite view of the notion of reciprocity of the patron-client factional framework underscores the concept of conflict, command, coercion, or even violence, called by various scholars in several ways, such as caciquism, bossism, sultanism. This view of politics is popularly known in the Philippines as warlordism. It is also colorfully labeled by media as 3Gs, referring to guns, gold, and goods. While bossism presents a somehow convincing argument for the preponderance of local bosses in far-flung provinces, it empirically fails to take into account the downward trend of warlordism and political violence in other parts of the country since the 1990s. While there are still some warlords firmly secured in their fiefdom, a lot has been dislodged both peacefully and violently. Other warlords have replaced some. Others have opted to be more sophisticated in their approach, making less use of brute force. Another perspective is the state-centric view. State-centric accounts of Philippine politics tend to explain why it is institutionally weak. The so-called weak state, strong society thesis. The weakness of the state is attributed to its lack of relative autonomy from the dominant sectors of society. From this perspective, the Philippine state is characterized as being captured instead of being autonomously embedded in competing and diverse social interests. Since it enjoys little autonomy from dominant social classes, political clans, powerful families, and other entrenched particularistic groups. Now, while the notion of a weak state provided more in depth insights on the seemingly changeless social, political, and economic problems plaguing the country, it became a theoretical straw man. It has also raised some interesting questions, like if the Philippine state is weak, what would a strong state look like? What segments of society are represented by the current weak state? If a state avoids doing the things which are inimical to the elite, is it necessarily weak? If the goal is to protect the interests of the top 10% or the top 1% of Philippine families, then has the state been quite strong? If a dominant class is strong enough to keep a state weak, why is it not strong enough to take over the state entirely? So these are the questions that most social scientists, particularly political scientists, have been asking about the notion of the weak state. But for the ordinary Filipino, the weak state is the lack of the preparedness for existential crisis, just like the pandemic, or even in the pre-pandemic era, the massive traffic and lack of delivery of public service that are a daily reality for majority of the Filipinos. Now, structural perspectives on patronage tend to disregard human agency or the capacity of individuals to act within structures and even change the course of events. The following are the essential theories of patronage. Most accounts of Philippine power dynamics tend to focus on political giants constantly engaged in great battles such as election campaigns or government activity or rebellion. Little or no attention is given to the nameless and oftentimes faceless collective mass of people that comprise Philippine society. More often than not, they are seen as um, passive followers, as in the patron-client model, or terrified victims, as in warlordism. The vast, generally unorganized and informal discourse and activity of everyday politics, where people come to terms with and contest norms and rules regarding authority, production, and the allocation of resources, is greatly overlooked until recently, no? With the help of the writings of Ben Kirkbride and James Scott. A variation of this notion of everyday politics is moral politics. Wataru Kasaka, whom I will discuss again later on, adopts a concept of moral politics, which refers to the creation of groups that are perceived as either good or evil. He distinguishes moral politics from interest politics, which pertains to the distribution of resources. He points to the moralistic discourse of the Filipino urban middle class, who takes pride in their self-identification as upright citizens, democratic defenders, and anti-corruption activists. Kusaka interprets this phenomenon as a primary example of the construction of an antagonistic we-they relations that may be mobilized to advance or obstruct democracy. Moreover, when this we-they is escalated to justify the elimination or destruction of the enemy, it becomes a threat to democracy. Now, moral politics tends to either blame the victim, just like the elitist notion of Bobotantes, or they glorify the poor, reification of the poor. Moral politics ignores the role of institutions in structuring individual and collective interaction. And it emphasizes subjectivism and even relativism. Another agential perspective focuses on the leader. And here we refer to populism, which has become uh, a recent popular buzzword in describing this administration. Populism, from the Latin word populis, refers to a movement, a regime, a leader, or even a state which claims close affinity with the people. As an ideology, it is misused or abused and sometimes reviled since it gives expression to the crudest hopes and fears of the masses, and by leaving no scope for deliberation and rational analysis. Populists usually make class appeals and claim to champion the poor. Uh, but according to Mueller, it is a degraded form of democracy that promises to make good on democracy's highest ideal. Let the people rule. No? Other philosophers have treated populism as a corrective of democracy, as a radical form of democracy. And we have a lot of philosophers from Mindanao articulating this view from Laclau and Wolf. Now, the election of Rodrigo Duterte to the Philippine presidency in 2016 signaled the return of a nationalist populist narrative first articulated by Joseph Erap Estrada in 1998. Duterte's unorthodox campaign style has captured the imagination of the Filipino voters. His political backstory runs parallel with the archetypical Filipino populist Erap Estrada. Their political narratives represent a strain of populism that has emerged as a challenge to the dominant liberal reformist narrative, also known as the EDSA narrative. Now let us address the myth of the so-called Bobotante. In the field of political science, Samuel Popkin asserts that generally voters behave rationally despite their apparent irrational choices. So this notion that voters from the lower social classes are sometimes irrational or even Bobotante is not a phenomenon that is to be found simply in the Philippines. No? It is also present in the United States. Case in point, the so-called Trump supporters, no, of the past, no, and of current American political dynamics. No? So, applying the concept of low information rationality, Popkin asserts that voters use information shortcuts that they receive during campaigns. And so campaigns are also important. No? For most of us, we complain about the lack of platforms, of issues, and it's all image, no? It's all narrative, no? But according to Samuel Popkin, that is part and parcel of how voters, no, use small amounts of personal information to construct a narrative about candidates. No? So voters use low information rationality gained in their daily lives through media and through personal interactions to evaluate candidates and facilitate electoral choices. So voters, no, tend to decide based on what they see on media, traditional and social media, and during the campaign. No? Which leads us to a version of this view by a good friend of mine, Mark Thompson from the City University of Hong Kong, who describes community-based electoral behavior of poor voters in Thailand and the Philippines as a form of moral economy of electoralism. From this perspective, Rural farmers and urban poor voters judge politicians based more on benefits to their local communities. No? So vote buying and patronage are not considered necessarily bad, but elections are the times when equality and justice are temporarily achieved as their patrons fulfill their financial obligation to support them in these times. No? So, from the perspective of the middle class or the rich, no, the educated, the intellectuals, academics, they're bobotantes. They're irrational for voting the same members of political class, the same actors, no, same celebrities, no. But from the perspective of the poor voters, these are hell. No? These are times in which the members of the traditional political class or uh, the members of the celebrity politicians are there to help them. No? So they are looking at it from a different worldview. Now let us go back to Wataru Kosaka and his moral politics. Now, going back to Wataru Kosaka's notion of moral politics, he bemoans the growing moralization of politics, which refers to the transformation of interest politics centered around resource distribution into moral politics predicated on definitions of right and wrong. Now, Kosaka was a graduate student living among the poor in the slums of Manila. He was into political anthropology. When he witnessed how the elites, the so-called dilawans, ousted ERAP at EDSA 2 and how the masa retaliated at EDSA 3. No? Hence, he developed this his theory of moral politics, and he said he also saw the trend of moral politics in Pinoy's, Noynoy Aquino's dissenting Filipino, and even Duterte's killing the drug addict rhetoric, no? Because it's an us against them. For Noynoy, no, kung walang korap, walang mahirap, meaning we are the, trust me, I am morally upright, no? And that same narrative is now being reiterated in the campaign of Leni Robredo, no? Gobyernong matapat, no? Buhay ay aangat, no? And then even for Duterte, no? By marking the drug addict as evil, no? It is a form of moral politics. Now, the Bobotante discourse of the Dilawan and the Kakampi is part of this moral politics, no? Now, whether the use of moral politics will be effective again, especially with the return of the Marcoses, it remains to be seen. Now, what are the implications of these theories for Philippine elections? For poor voters, vote selling is a logical choice in contrast to the notion of Bobotante or uneducated votes. According to a study of the Institute of Philippine Culture of the Ateneo de Manila University, this study was conducted, I think, around 2015 to 2016. Now, based on a series of focus group discussion in several communities, the members of this research team classified the poor as among those in the rural areas, urban cities, disaster-stricken communities, and those in conflict situations. The poor communities they surveyed generally consider giving money during elections as a form of vote buying. However, and to give credence to the assertions of Thompson and Pusaka, rural voters may also see vote selling as a form of help. Poor voters, for example, from disaster areas and rural communities, tend to accept the money but still have the choice of not voting for the candidates who provided it. These people are willing to receive the money, but are also willing to use their agency, according to my good friend, sociologist Jail Cornelio of the Ateneo. For some voters, they see money as a form of grace, biyaya, no? Cornelio said. And they see it as a blessing, no? Hulog ng langit, biyaya, and something that they deserve, especially those in disaster-stricken areas. In the 2016 TV5 SWS exit poll, 57.3% of respondents point to platform as against personality as the main reason for their choice of presidential candidate. 72.7% said that the debates helped them in selecting their president, while 68.7% said the debates helped them choose their vice president. So, another survey, no? According to the December 7 to 12, 2021 Okta Research survey, no? Okta Research, the same firm that provides us with the pandemic data. According to the Okta Research survey, 11% of respondents would change their vote based on performance in the debates. No? When they were asked, if you already have a candidate, what would make you change your mind and choose another candidate? 11% are saying debates, no, would make them change their mind. Now, that 11% is a modest number, but it's significant. Why? Because that 11% comes, when you break it down, no, 17% of that 11% comes from voters who are situated in Luzon. Luzon is the largest base of voters in the Philippines. And they come from Class D. 14% comes from Class D. Luzon has the largest bulk of voters at 45%, and 78% of voters are from Class D. So that 11% is still significant, no? And if you add that to the growing 14% of undecided, contrary to most observation that this election is over, it ain't over until it's over. No? So these are modest numbers, but significant. And contrary to the conventional wisdom that only Class A, B, C, and from NCR are interested in these debates and fora, it's not true. Now, in closing, I'd just like to say that the poor are thinking voters. They vote rationally. Vote selling is a rational act for the poor. What we have, the problem, I think, and this is from my own personal analysis, is that what we have been seeing in the past decades is the supply side, no, of trapos and dynasties overcoming the demand side, which is the side of the voters and the majority of poor citizens. Accepting goods and money in exchange for votes is rational under this situation. But the problem is how the so-called educated or the ABC class behave vis-a-vis these poor voters. No? Now, if you are campaigning for your candidate and you somehow belong to the ABC crowd, no? I'd just like to leave with this message. In the political market, you don't insult your consumer. If you want to sell your product, you convince them to buy your product. Now, calling the poor Bobotantes is a condescending attitude, an elitist attitude. It's like blaming the victims. The real solution, I think, is the need to change the structural roots of poverty that makes these voters and community dependent on traditional politicians and dynasties. In the same manner, candidates and their supporter should understand should understand and converse with the poor voters and the voters in general and not call them Bobotantes. Thank you very much for your kind attention. To see more of my lecture and media appearances, please visit my YouTube channel, Talk Politics with Julio Teehankee. And don't forget to like, comment, share, and click the subscribe button. Maraming salamat po.
Thank you very much, Dr. Teehankee. And for our audience online, I highly recommend you following this YouTube channel kasi was watching during the height of the pandemic. I was watching your discussion about populist resiliency. Why,
Yes.
bakit even though the poor performance of the national government by more objective metrics, like if we compare it with other Asian countries, but the popularity of the government is really abnormal if you contrast it against the popularity of our neighboring countries. And as you've mentioned before, it's quite complex when you go to the ground, and with the empirical data that you provide with us, it's really painting a very complex picture, which resonate to a really old what do you call this? Really old philosophical conundrum that people are not really don't really want evil, but really want what appears to be good. And siguro, I can start the question with at least with my impression of. I was reading this paper on family networks and how basically the claim is during the 2016 election, the family networks and the system of clientelism is not being judged by it's not being determined by voters' education, but rather by family heads. And
Right.
basically, when the family head decides that a particular voter, a particular candidate will reflect their values, or rather, they will have economic privileges from that particular candidate, they tend to support it. Siguro, my question, or at least to start the open forum, is, uh, and I think you've answered it somewhat, is how do we address this really problematic relationship with the material needs of the people, and of course how it translates to political actions.
Okay, so thank you. Thank you very much for that question. Well, how should I begin? Again, no. Can you please repeat the question? Haba kasi nung sinabi mo. Ano?
Basically, ang gusto ko lang sigurong tanungin is yung challenge of maybe yung reflection, yung a constant problem even for among us philosophers is sometimes we have the tendency to speak on behalf of to borrow from Spivak, the subaltern, and ang naging
Right.
problema dun is sometimes nagkakaroon ng blind spot, and yung family
Right.
relationships is one of the blind spot that at least
I see.
the
Okay.
researcher that I've consulted. So
Right.
how do we overcome that? And
Yeah.
you've also mentioned in Dr. Teehankee yung moral politics and yung
Yeah.
appeal ng
Right.
yung tatay, ako yung nanay, ako yung mag-unite
Right.
sa
Right.
matima. And those
Yeah.
are really very strong familial
Yeah.
elements.
Yes. Thank you. Yeah. Well, as I've mentioned in my presentation, no, the situation that we have really is that uh, we cannot blame the poor for behaving the way they do during elections because they have no choice, right? And the reason why they do not have choice is that our elections, our politics is structured from the supply side. No? If to borrow economics terms, no, To borrow economics terms, our politics is structured on the demand side. So even the values and norms of our political dynamics are shaped by the values and norms of the ruling political class. And in our case, it's the ruling dynasties and political class. No? So that's why even the way we uh, use metaphors, no, na kailangan ang presidente ang ama ng bansa, no, or 'di ba, or ina ng bansa in the case of Cory, no, or tita ng bansa, no. So that is exactly how politics has emerged, no, and of course in the political Filipino political philosophy, no, the primary exponent of this view of organic cultural familial-based politics is of course Remigio Agpalo, no, with his Pangulo regime concept, no. So that is exactly why, no, we need to strike a balance between the structural roots of poverty and inequality without losing sight also of the agential factors. Why? Because the agential factors uh, introduce the discourse, the narrative, the ideas, no, that challenges these structural constraints. So my favorite sociologist is Anthony Giddens, no, and his famous contribution to sociology is structuration, no, because the long epistemological ontological debate between structure and agency, his solution is that not to privilege one over the other, but to look at both. It's both structure and agency. No? So that's the reason why every time we say there are bad or good leaders, there are bad or good presidents, bad or good families or dynasties, it's not a question of good or bad dynasties, leaders, presidents, or families. It's a question of good and bad structures or systems. No? Because if you have a good, if you have a bad structure and a bad system, then uh, there's no more choice. No? But if you have a good system and what, if you have good people within bad structures, no, you can still survive. But if you have bad structures and bad leaders, then we are in the mess, no. So it's really a question of good, not good or bad individuals, but good or bad structures or systems.
That's very good. That's a very good insight, Dr. Teehankee. And I think that also answered a couple of questions that I'm receiving from YouTube and Facebook right now. So I'm gonna read a couple of questions, and maybe I'm gonna include them. So one question is from Juan Gabriel Reyes. Basically, how can we educate those who refuse to read books and articles, or even listen to really academic talks like this one in the internet, that and they're more reliable on things that because they will say that it has a bias, bias of,
Right.
yeah, basically a bias. So this is from Mr. Reyes.
Okay, and that's the irony, no? In this day and age, in which information and knowledge, no, can be have for, just like that on social media, you have all these sources of information. No? It's so ironic that people, do not consult all the wealth of wisdom, no, that are to be found. Instead, they prefer misinformation and disinformation. No? Again, well, it's a function of perhaps, no, public intellectuals and academics, no, should also adjust to the situation, and that's what me and most of our colleagues in the academe are doing. Not by sitting in the ivory tower, no, not by just publishing in obscure journals for the heck of it, but rather to also, we also must continue producing knowledge and publishing and doing research. At the same time, we have to also produce for the mass public, no? And that's the reason why a lot of us are now into public intellectual mode, no? Especially during election time. And it takes up a lot of our time, no? Sometimes it's so difficult to say no. Sometimes you have to check your papers, you have to prepare for your online class, but you are asked to give our part. And that's part of our civic duties, no? As members of the thinking class, no? Academia. No? I think that's the only way, well, one of the ways by which we can at least address the problem of misinformation and disinformation. So we, as members of the intellectual class, no, public intellectual, we must also do our part by engaging the public.
Yun nga po yung naging problema. Minsan ho, ang kasalanan ng social media is kung sino yung pinakamalakas at sino yung pinakasikat sa TikTok. Mas pinapakinggan.
Yeah.
So siguro isa challenge. So sa challenge natin is yung bumalik tayo sa sobriety of talking to each other. Kasi katulad nga minention namin sa sa naming discussion is mas mabilis maging cruel, maging mag-insulto pag social media. Pero kaya kailangan kong ibalik ulit yung usapan sa level ng usapan. So siguro ang susunod
kasi
na question ay...
nangyari lang yan nung itong mga nakarang wala pang 10 taon, no? Kasi naalala ko nung unang nagkaroon ng social media, no, Friendster naman. Tsaka MySpace walang ganito, no? Di ba? Tsaka no Facebook in the early years, di ba? Poke lang ang uso noon, no? So ngayon kasi nagamit, no? And of course, itong katanungan na ito, itong issue na ito, hindi lang bago ito. Kasi panahon pa man ng mga ancient Greeks, winarn na tayo ng mga ancient Greek philosophers na ito yung dark side of democracy, no? So, at winarn na rin tayo ni Jose Rizal kung bakit nga alangan siya na magrevolusyon kagad tayo, no? Kung walang edukasyon talaga, ang demokrasya ay mahina at marupok, no? So ang mahalaga talaga ay edukasyon at civic education, no? Bago pa maubos ng oras, gusto ko na nga isingit to, no? Bakit tayo nandito kung nasaan tayo, no? How ironic na this year is the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Martial Law. At malamang kung hindi mapipigilan, ang magiging pangulo ngayong taon nito ay isang Ferdinand Marcos din. So that's the irony of history, no? Na on the 50th anniversary of martial law, ang magiging pangulo natin ay isang Marcos, no? At ang kauna-unahang magiging majority president sa post-Marcos period ay isa ding Marcos, no? So yun yung nakakapagtaka, di ba? So talagang siguro ang isipin natin ang ginawa ng mga Aleman, mga Germans noong pagkatapos ng World War II, no? Bakit nagnilay-nilay ang mga Aleman at inisip na bakit ang isang Hitler ay naging makapangyarihan sa era ng demokrasya, no? Bago siya naging diktator. Kasi nga sa kahinaan ng mga civic institution. Kaya ang una nilang ginawa ay nagmandato sila ng civic education, political education. That's the reason why I'm so against the term voters education. Dahil pag sinabi voters education, sinasabi mong may bobo yung mga botante. Hindi kailangan ng botante ang education, mas kailangan pa ng politiko ang education, no? So ang better term, no, ay civic education. Lahat tayo kailangan mag-aral muli paano maging isang citizen na may set of freedom at may set of responsibilities, no?
At delikado rin po kasi yung pag-voters education para pag natapos ng election, balik na ulit sa nakagawan instead na paulit-ulit na contribution sa demokrasya natin. So, siguro ready na po tayo sa next question po. Galing po sa YouTube, si Mr. Fernando. How can an educated person convince the persons who are regarded to be irrational in the election or bobotante in a moral approach of convincing? Basically, how I understand this is paano convince yung mga bobotante, so to speak, in a moral approach. He's from Iligan City.
Ano uli yan? Kasi binabasa ko rin yung ibang questions dito.
Okay.
Pakiulit, please.
Basically, ang tinatanong po ni Mr. Fernando is, how can an educated person convince the persons who are regarded to be Bobotante in a moral approach? Or basically, ano yung mga strategy? If I understand correctly,
No.
ano yung mga strategy natin to...
I see. Oo. Unang-una, don't be moralistic. Diba?
Yeah,
Try
that's
to
very
be
dangerous now.
Kasi yun nga yung problema, no? Pag nagiging moralistic, you tend to look down on people, no? Especially isipin niyo na lang kasi, no? Halimbawa itong pandemic nito, no? Eh, karamihan sa atin na medyo may kakayahan yung pamilya natin, magulang natin, no? Okay lang sa atin online class, work from home, di ba? Kahit magtago tayo sa mga bahay at condominium natin at manood lang ng Netflix at K-drama the whole time. Pero sa ordinaryong mamamayan, iba ang mundo nila, no? So yun lang naman, no? Kung tayo ay ikokondema natin sila for voting the way they vote, no? Isipin natin ano yung sitwasyon nila. Bakit sila napipilitan tumanggap ng pera? May nakita ako dito from Brillantes Law, mahirap tanggapin nga na pag nagbenta, rational yun. Yeah. Pero ano ba yung rational, di ba? Pursuing self-interest is the philosophical definition of being rational, di ba? And, if you're poor, and that's the only time you can get something out of these politicians, then it's rational. But is it right? That's a moral question, di ba? So, yun yung dilemma natin, no? Sabi nga natin, by being moralistic, lalong na-drive away to mga voters from what is really moral, no? So, it's a paradox. It's a philosophical conundrum, and that's the reason why I'm happy to be with you this afternoon. You're all philosophers. I minored in philosophy, by the way. So, I can be a member of your association. So, no? How we converse, we communicate, we go back to square one, no? Diba? We communicate in the ways we communicated before social media, diba? Na kasi nga iba yung persona natin pag sa social media, tumatapang tayo, diba? Herd mentality and all that. Yes. And by the way, I'm not an attorney, no? I come from a family of lawyers, but I'm not an attorney. Nakita ko may nag-attorney.
Ang nga po, Dok, kaya totoo rin yung sinasabi rin nila na hirap mag-isip gutom ka. Kaya tama rin yung sinabi niyo doon sa program. Ang hirap mag-moralize from an ABC standard kung yung D is, ang problema nila is for the day lang. Tayo kasi, ang ABC is we have the luxury to think ahead of our investments from 10 years from now. And bakit sa tingin natin pangit investment in a particular politician.
Yeah.
But a person from D has a particular interest or economic interest na hindi kailangan natin maintindihan at kausapin. So,
may nakita ko mga comments dito. Can I comment on? Like, kay Dean Glenn. Si Dean Glenn, my good friend, no? Epistemological barrier and limitation of the masses to access the truth about our politicians and the masses' source of knowledge about politicians are merely secondary source, if not unreliable sources. Spoken like a true philosopher, I totally agree, Dean. And then Dean Glenn, they also have their own epistemological worldview. No? They also have their own ontology. No? So talagang hindi magtutugma yan unless we try to bridge the two. No? And then from Jolette Velasco of Mary Hill School, how can we promote conversion? Conversion towards moral politics when we are in a familial structure ruled by interest politics, seemingly valuing familial choices. And the point of Wataru Kusaka is that he finds it problematic that we are veering towards moral politics. Moral politics for him is not an ideal but a problematic. No, when we start looking at politics and we start looking at people as us against them, we they good or bad manner, then it becomes a problematic. So Perhaps one way to address this is to go back to simply dealing with politics as a material interest distributional process, no? Minus the good or evil. Kasi good or evil can also result in genocide, no? Remember what happened in Cambodia, di ba? And in other totalitarian states. No? Once you are deemed bad, patay ka, and we've experienced that in the past 6 years, no? So, di ba? So, yun. Sige,
Very
continue.
important rin po yung idea ng very important rin po yung idea na naalala ko si Arendt with that discussion na
Right.
hindi she's very resistant to the idea na the truth should be part of politics, that the truth ends any political discussion. Once you assume na nasa iyo yung katotohanan, ikaw yung nasa tama,
Precisely.
it's no longer
Diba?
politics. It stops being politics. So,
Diba,
siguro ang solution na
yung, di ba yan
solution
nga yung
na
difference between pseudoscience and science, no? Once you start seeing na infallible ka, di ba? Hindi ka na science, di ba? Please continue, sorry. About Arendt.
Tama rin po yung sinabi po ninyo na siguro po isang opportunity na yung mga ganito pong ginagawa natin na or rather yung solution na in-offer ni Arendt is we have to learn to stop and think about what we should do. And people like us na we are occupying the ABC class should also use this time to not enforce but rather invite people to think about in a deeper way rather than just being carried away by things. Siguro we're also ready for another question.
Sige, please.
Last pa tayong isang question.
Sige, ang daming comments.
Oo nga po eh.
Oo.
Ay, ito pa. Kay Sicha Manantil, I asked if we still have hope in changing the bad system into a good system. So basically, siguro ang question rin dito is how do we evaluate if a system is already good? If a majority of us are being submerged in the patronage system.
Definitely, we need to change the system, no? Particularly, itong nakikita natin ngayong halalan na ito, no? It's more of the same, no? Even among the major competitors, no? Sino ba sa kanila ang may talagang alternative, no? Actually, isa o dalawa lang ang talagang may radical alternative na talagang pag silang nanalo, kaso malabo silang manalo, mababago talaga yung sistema. No? Si Leody de Guzman or even Bert Gonzalez are offering really transformational programs. No? But, the rest are simply mouthing the same neoliberal, good governance rhetoric, anti-corruption eklat. No? Alam naman natin na pag naupo sila, wala naman mangyayari dyan, di ba? So, that's the problem. And same personality-oriented politics, no? It's all sloganeering, motherhood, wala naman talagang tunay na pagbabago. No? Kung meron man, dati may nangako ng tuwid na daan at saka tunay na pagbabago, pero hindi rin naman natupad lahat. So, unless we change the way we do politics, and that's actually changing our structure and systems of politics, then, we just go we'll keep on repeating the same mistakes, no? And actually, putting into practice structurational analysis, no? Agent structure, no? You start with us, no? You start with yourself, no? There's truth to that cliche, no? Change begins in you, no? So if you start changing the way you act and it's repeated through time, it becomes part of the rules of the game, it becomes institution. So walang makakapagbago ng Pilipinas kundi tayo rin mga Pilipino. And I believe in that. No? And we should start by unang-una educating ourselves. No? Wag na muna natin isipin yung ibang tao. No? Magsimula muna tayo sa sarili. Let's educate ourselves so that when we deal with other people, we know how. No? What's the proper perspective, and we're not just mouthing insults, no? And feeling holier than thou. No? And then, institutionally, there's really a need to bring back social sciences, education, Filipino culture, all the civics in our educational system na pinagtatanggal, no? In the past 2 decades, 3 decades, nawala. I remember in my elementary, high school, no, every week, no, we have current events digest, we have, history, current events, social sciences, and this helped mold my generation, no, who fought against the dictatorship, by the way. And nawala na rin sa college, no? Pagtuturo ng politics and governance, binaba sa high school. No? And then, sa media natin, no? Nawala na yung mga public affairs program sa prime time. Dati, mapapanood mo sila Randy David sa prime time. At ang newscasters mo, talagang mga decente pinagpipitagan na believable at credible. No? Eh ngayon, puro telenovela and all that. No? So, we need to go back to basics.
Wow. Sorry, Dr. Teehankee. That's all that
Yeah.
we have for the open forum.
I understand.
And for everyone
yes.
who is commenting right now, I apologize. It's just very a very insightful day for us, and marami pang questions that should be raised and answered in a more deeper level. So siguro maganda rin na i-follow yung YouTube channel ni Dr. Teehankee kung may mga questions kayong gusto i-follow up direct to him. Ang YouTube niyo po is yan po. Talk Politics with Julio Teehankee. www.talkpoliticswithjulioteehankee. And also, plug ko na rin yung dalawang organization na PNPRS and Isip Boto, if you want to join us and talk deeper and sabi nga ni Aren, to stop and to think what we're doing right now in order to act on things that we can do tomorrow. Anyhow, siguro I'm gonna read the certificate and certificate of appreciation from PNPRS and Isip Boto. And this is the certificate, Philippine National Philosophical Research Society and Isip Boto award the certificate of appreciation to Professor Julio Teehankee, PhD. Gratitude for sharing the insightful lecture with the title Theories of Patronage and the Myth of the Bobotante in the May Papel ba ang Pamimilosopiya sa Eleksyon? At ano ito? A PNPRS Isip Boto joint webinar on voters' education held on February 12, 2022 at 2:00 p.m. via Facebook and YouTube. Signed by Flor de Lis Altes Albela, PhD, our Isip Boto convenor, Jove Jim S. Aguas, PhD, PNPRS Executive Governor, Juan Rafael G. Macaranas, PhD, PNPRS Chairman. So, thank you again, Dr. Teehankee, for sharing your these insights with us. So I'm gonna call to the stage Ma'am Glove, our PNPRS legal officer.
Yan. Thank you po ulit sa ating napakagaling na speaker at sa ating napakagaling din na moderator. So, bigyan po natin sila ng virtual clap. Yan po. So, the next highlight ng ating event is as equally interesting and timely topic. Pero bago po tayo pumunta doon, let us take a short breather and watch a simple short audiovisual presentation rather.
The Philippine National Philosophical Research Society, or PNPRS, is a society of philosophy professors and students whose advocacy is to make philosophy an essential instrument and academic discipline in nation building and world understanding. PNPRS recognizes loyalty to philosophy and the nation. It promotes philosophical research and publication through its internationally indexed journal, Philosophia, International Journal of Philosophy, which publishes articles that present all types of philosophical views. PNPRS is a venue for philosophical inquiry and academic exchange of ideas to form not just scholars but also world-class philosophers. Let us strengthen Filipino philosophy across borders and make philosophy a catalyst for nation building. Join us!
hapon po sa lahat. Welcome to a webinar on voters education with the theme, May papel ba ang pamimilosopiya sa eleksyon? So this is sponsored by Philippine National Philosophical Research Society, PNPRS, and Philosophical Association of the Philippines, ISIP Boto. The topic of our speaker today is very interesting as it is also timely, considering the boom of discussions about politics and about the election through various social media like Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram, if there is. With the kickoff of the election campaign here in the Philippines yesterday, we can really see how engaged citizens and netizens are. So, with all of this that are happening right now in lieu of the coming election, we really have to ask what or how and when or how can we engage with our fellow voters or electorates, especially when we have different political views. So, this is precisely what our speaker will be sharing to us today. So, on tips for engaging with voters. Now, before we proceed to the talk, allow me to give a short background about our speaker. Our speaker, Miss Athena Sharan Ash Presto, is a community engaged sociologist whose main interest lies in gender and development, human rights, and social inequalities. She is currently taking up graduate studies in public policy at the National University of Singapore while teaching part-time at the Ateneo de Manila University and doing consultancy work for the United Nations Development Program. Prior to joining NUS, she taught sociology at the University of the Philippines, Diliman, where she took her bachelor's in sociology summa cum laude. Ash currently sits as an officer of various civil society and youth organizations, including the Youth Against Sexual Harassment and the Young Southeast Asian Leaders Initiative, where she serves as the country lead for its network of women alumni. Lastly, she also tweets at Socioloiha. Wow, did I pronounce that right? Socioloiha. So those who want to tweet and retweet or follow her on Twitter, that is her Twitter account, Socioloiha. Speaking of tweeting, bago po natin papasukin si Miss Ash, kumusta po tayong lahat? Nakapag-tweet, retweet, comment, like, and share na po ba tayo sa ating mga manok sa eleksyon? Sa usaping eleksyon, ano po sa tingin natin? May papel nga ba ang pamimilosopiya? So may papel ba ang pamimilosopiya sa eleksyon? At kung meron, ano ang mga ito? Habang pinag-iisipan po natin yan, makinig po tayo sa ating speaker on tips for engaging with voters. Let us welcome Miss Ash Presto. Ash, pasok.
Hello, Globe. Nice to be here. Happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me. Hi, Chika.
So we're ready for you, Miss Ash. So we can start with we can start.
Yes, thank you. So I have started sharing my screen. I prepared a very short presentation on the topic that you have asked me to discuss. So without further ado, let's proceed. My presentation will focus more on young voters, so the youth, because I'd like to think I'm still part of the youth, so that's my strength. So I hope you learn some tips from me today that are useful to you, especially in engaging with young voters. All right, so I know a lot of you have already seen this survey. So this was done last June 2021, but the thing that I want to ask regarding surveys now is that what do these polls mean? Ano ibig sabihin ng mga past survey natin na to? Ibig sabihin, ba kung sino yung nag-number one dito sa survey na to, siya na yung mananalo sa susunod na eleksyon? Na kung sino man yung lumalabas na pangalan dyan, sila na yung pinaka-qualified na tumakbo sa buong Pilipinas. Sila na yung mga may pinaka-magagandang track record. At lahat na ng mga tao ay full-heartedly sumusuporta kung sino man yung nakikita nyo sa screen na to. And of course, that's not necessarily the case. So polls also have their own limitations. They give us a lot of insights, of course, regarding the pulse of the nation, the choices of voters, the kind of leaders that people are looking for. But the limitations lie on not showing a lot of heterogeneity within the people being polled. So the first thing that I want us to learn from this is that first, voters are not homogeneous. Okay, the answer to the second question, are voters homogeneous, is a big, big no. And O na malaking letters, naka-bold, font 100, font Calibri. So, anong pagkakaiba ng mga voters na to? In many aspects. So first, you have different people coming from different geographical areas in the Philippines. Right? Me, I was born and I grew up in Vigan City, which is a very beautiful city and which explains my virtual background. I am an Ilocana, born and raised, and my parents were born and grew up also in the Ilocos region. But I know more voters are not like me. A lot of people grew up in the Visayas, in Mindanao. They have different lived experiences. Okay, so aside from geographical differences, we also have age differences, of course, and I know a lot of conversations on elections centered on the age difference, with young voters comprising the majority of the voters population for the 2022 elections. And a lot of people are now asking, how do you engage with people from different age groups, right? And because people are from different age groups, they also gravitate towards different social media platforms. Gaya na sabi ni Globe kanina, may Facebook, may Instagram. Also, aside from that, we have different concerns. A lot of people will be very much concerned with issues on marriage. Napakalaking issue yung divorce. Ngayon, laging tinatanong sa mga presidente, maybe because they're married, maybe because they don't want to get married, maybe because they're single, maybe because they want a divorce, right? Or maybe because they are happily married also. People will also differ in terms of their sexual orientation, gender identity, gender performance, and of course, sexual characteristics, right? So we also have questions targeted towards the presidentiables about same-sex marriage, about anti-discrimination, etc. People will also come from very obviously, very starkly different socioeconomic classes. Okay, lagi yan. In every poll, they try to distinguish kung sino yung malakas dun sa class A and B, kung sino yung malakas dun sa class D and E. Kasi napaka-iba nung lived experiences, iba yung klase ng rhetoric, narrative, and political branding na kailangan mo para makuha mo yung mga boto na yun. So, even if these polls show us a lot of insights, we also should recognize that they don't show us exactly the heterogeneity among the voters. So this heterogeneity will be the main focal point for us to know how basically to engage with the kind of voters that we want to engage. Okay, so I have here one concept. It's called information asymmetry. So what do I mean by information asymmetry? I'm now talking about that third question in my slide. Is information asymmetry a large concern? The answer is a huge yes. So what does information asymmetry mean? It means that different people have access to different information. Okay? And because they have access to different information, they will be nudged to have different kinds of perceptions towards different candidates. They will be nudged to form different opinions on different social issues. Right? And it doesn't mean that just because you are consuming the same set of information will automatically make you have the same set of beliefs and opinions also and perspectives. That's not the case. Napakaraming mga pagkakaiba dyan. Ano yung kinokonsume mong balita? How do you make sense of all of this information that you're consuming? Where do you get the news that you're consuming? Are you getting them on Facebook? Are you getting them from traditional credible media? Are you getting them from your friends? Are you getting them from the marites out there? Sa mga kapitbahay mo? Diba? Of course, you also know that because we are positioned very differentially in the social grid, we will also have different access, different types of information that is available to us. So, yung mga may kayang magbayad, yung mga may paywall na news sites, yung mga may internet, yung mga may access sa napakarami mga gadgets, of course, they will have more capabilities to do a Google search. They will have more capabilities to cross-check and to fact-check the information that are being given to them. Pero yung mga taong nakarely sa free Facebook because Facebook is free, of course, mahirap yun. Bana nakaasa ka sa Facebook information because it's free and you can access it. Okay, so I know we'll talk about all of this heterogeneity later on. So ano pa lang to? Appetizer. Ayan, so tapos appetizer, meron tayo ibang ita-try na dish. Okay. So, of course, polls also will give you an idea of the different composition of the voters. So, you can see here, in terms of registration, and I don't claim, by the way, any ownership of all of the photos I'm showing here. So, lahat ng ito, nakuha ko ng publicly available information sa internet, more from credible news sites ang pinagkuhanan ko. Alright, so meron kang voters by region. Region 4A, ang laki niya. And you also see the distribution of voters per region, whether they're from Gen Z, from Millennials, from Gen X, and baby boomers. So you see that ang daming, if you combine the numbers of Gen Z and Millennial voters, majority ng voting population sila na. Kaya ang daming mga nagpapander towards younger voters ngayong halalan na ito. And you also have different composition of voters in terms of gender. Meron kang 50.12 voters registered na mga lalaki, 49.88% naman ay mga babae. And that's only in terms of their sexual characteristics. That doesn't show us also their gender identities, whether they identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, transsexual, pansexual, etc. We don't even know. And of course, because they have different SOGs, they also have different perceptions, and we're looking for different kinds of advocacies and platforms from our candidates. Of course, elections is a numbers game. But again, what lies behind these numbers? At the end of the day, gusto mo majority ng boto sa'yo. Pag nagbibilang ka, gusto mo ikaw yung may pinakamalaking slice of the pie kapag elections. Pero ganun-ganun na lang ba yun? Kasi may mga nagtatanong sa akin, Ash, majority of the voting population now ay mga bata. So do you think all of these campaigns should engage young voters? Kasi sila yung battleground. Sila yung winning over mo para manalo ka. I will say, well, not necessarily. Kasi even if you have this number, of course, what lies behind those numbers? Relationships. At hindi ito relationships na nagjojowaan. Alam mo kung malapit na mag-Valentine's. Hindi ito yung jojowaan kayo. Relationships meaning your interactions with people around you. And my background is from sociology, so I'm super big on examining the relationships between voters, politicians, voters to voters, politician to politician, etc. Now, ito na ang meat. Mamaya ko na ibaback ko muna pala. Ito na ang meat. Kung appetizer yun, ito na yung main course ha. So, introduction aside, let's go to the meat of my discussion. So, I know young people, ang audience, ang target audience natin ngayon. So, if you know this, yan si Towa, na TikTok star siya, TikTok influencer. Tapos, laging nagsastart yung videos niya na, sabi ng mama mo, jowain daw kita, mahalin daw kita, yung mga ganyan. Kaya siya sumikat, nakakatawa siya. So, yung sabi ng mama mo, jowain daw kita, parang merong social relationships na doon eh. So, bakit andito tong meme na to? Layo-layo nung discuss ni Ash, bakit andito yung meme na to? It will make sense, okay? Okay, now, let's proceed. I prepared here four main tips on how to engage voters, specifically young voters. First is, of course, get to know your audience. Okay, so I know my focus is young voters, but even young voters are not homogeneous. They are a very diverse group. Sobrang diverse social group nila. For reasons I've already mentioned at the start of my presentation. So get to know your audience. Why is this important? Because by getting to know your audience, you will also get to know the kinds of narratives that will be most interesting and most relatable to them. You will get to know their main concerns as a social group. You will also get to know like what kind of messaging, right, will they absorb. So kapag ako, kausap ko for example yung isang batang na pinalaya sa bahay kasi nalaman na bakla siya. Of course, iba din yung klase ng pagkikipag-usap ko sa kanya. So, paano ko siya kakausapin in terms of the election? Sasabihin ko, uy, sino kaya sa mga tumatakbong presidente yung sumusuporta sa same-sex marriage? Uy, sino kaya sa mga tumatakbong presidente yung nagsabing dapat hindi bigyan ng equal rights ang mga member ng LGBT community? Sino kaya yung mga yon? So, iba yung concern. Kapag kausap ko naman yung isang batang nahihirapan, isang college student na nahihirapan sa nursing course niya. Kasi una, napaka-practice-oriented ng nursing course. Kailangan mo nasa practicum ka. Kailangan mo, hindi yan mag-work outside of any physical setting. At pangalawa, nahihirapan siyang mag-modular learning kasi wala siyang internet, wala siyang laptop, tsaka yung kapitbahay niya ayaw magpahiram ng wifi. Diba? So, the form of engagement, of course, that I will pursue ay yung sino ba yung sa mga presidente yung sumusuporta sa, accessible education. At sino sa mga presidente, so yung mga tumatakbo, not just president, even senators or their mayor or their local executives, sino sa kanila yung may track record na ng pagsuporta sa mga estudyante. At sino yung may track record na sa pagsuporta nung transition from being a student to being part of the labor force. Okay? So, first tip, I guess, again, I get to know your audience. Second is, of course, choose your platform. So, different age groups, of course, populate different social media platforms. So, the Gen X boomers will be gravitating on Facebook. Yung mga mas bata naman, more TikTok sila. Tapos yung mga Gen Z, mga bata din, nasa Twitter din sila, mga Instagram. So choose your platform. At hindi lang ito choosing platform, ha? It's also the way that you engage and understanding the platform that you chose. So for example, the kinds of political performance and political messaging that will gain virality in different social media platforms are also different. You will never be viral on Twitter if you post the way that you post on Facebook. Facebook, ang haba ng mga post like, ay, taray, pa-essay siya, pwede nang isubmit ng essay sa 500 na to Pero sa Twitter, hindi pwede yon. Of course, you can always make it a thread, right? Because Twitter only lets you tweet for up to like a specified short number of characters lang. So, ang ginagawa ng iba, ginagawa siyang thread. So, series of tweets siya na isang mahabang thread. Pero kasi, yung punch per tweet, kailangan para magka-gain ng virality yung thread mo. Hindi katulad sa Facebook na ang importante, introduction tsaka conclusion, tsaka may picture ka pa para mag-viral. Diba? Hindi rin kagaya nung interaction na kailangan sa TikTok. Iba din yung kind of interaction na kailangan sa TikTok. Like, kailangan siya musical, entertaining, maraming gumagalaw. May pasabog sa dulo, yung mga ganyan. So, iba siya. So, choose your platform basically because people who come from different places in the social grid will also be present in different social media platforms, and they will also respond differently to different styles of messaging and the different kinds of messaging. Choose your platform. Third topic, general topic, is think of yourself in all aspects. Una, isipin mo yung sarili mo kasi kung sino yung mananalo sa eleksyon ay magkakaroon ng malaking epekto sa personal life mo. So this is personal. So this is personal to me. All elections are personal. Kasi aapektuhan yung private life mo. And think of yourself in a way that you have to also know your strength. Okay, so for example, when I know that your main problem is in terms of the medical, in terms of like medical access, mental health, mga ganyan, kakambyo ako dyan ng very slight. Sabihin ko, oo nga no, ang hirap yan. Kasi specifically in terms of the social stigma attached to mental health, ang hirap yan. So I can talk about the social stigma because I come from a background of sociology. Right? So I can never talk about all of these oxytocin, mga ganyan, mga different hormones involved. There are different kinds of like, yung details niya, intricacies na ng medical condition, na kahit yun yung concern mo, may limit din yung kind of engagement na pwede kong, you know, na pwede kong i-perform sa'yo. Kasi may pinagagalingan ako at hindi ako expert sa lahat ng mga to. So basically, you have to also play on your strength. Okay? So think of yourself, all elections are personal, think of yourself, think about your strengths and gravitate from there and capitalize on your strengths to engage with other voters. And think of yourself na hindi naman lahat ng mga taong kaya mo i-engage eh. Like, hindi naman lahat ng mga voters will respond to you in good faith. So, I've heard stories of friendships ending because of politics and because of moral values. Because at the end of the day, who you vote for also reflects the moral values that you have. So some relationships end because of the differences in moral values. Some relationships end because of differences in voting preferences. Ang hirap niyang i-bear. So, minsan iniisip mo, no, I will still engage with their person. Kahit na obvious naman na sobrang bad faith niya. Every post mo, kinokomentan niya ng sobrang nakaka-insultong comment or naghahaha siya sa lahat ng kapag sinasabi mo, bakit ka po naghaha? Tapos ang reply din niya lang, haha. So, di ba napaka-bad faith? So, think of your mental health. So, kung kaya mong makipag-engage peacefully, with dignity, with humility, sa mga tao na to, go. Encourage ko yan. Pero kapag obviously, sobrang bad faith makipag-engage ng tao. I mean, you have to also think of yourself, your mental health, etc. Lastly, think of yourself, think of putting yourself on the shoes of someone that you're engaging. Yan yung sinasabi ng mga chikiting ngayon na empathy, yung mga ganyan. So, alam niyo na yun, be empathetic. Kung ikaw yung nasa posisyon niya, anong feel mo, di ba? Ang dali kasing sabihin, napakaboba naman niya. Pero kasi kung ikaw din naman yung wala access sa Google sis, baka yan din yung maisip mo na si ganto-ganto ang best president ever kasi ang source mo ng information ay Facebook. Right? Or ano ba yan? Parang wala siyang goodness of heart. Napaka-corrupt niya, maitim ang buduhin niya. Pero kasi kung ikaw yung lumaki, for example, in my case, sa Ilocos, that actually everybody starts off as having this kind of aspiration to be like that certain past president, former president, who is touted as the most illustrious president ever in the history of Ilocos. At pipilitan kang mag-field trip bilang kinder dun sa bahay niya at mag-field trip kayo, isa-isa around ng coffee niya. Iisipin mo din, gusto ko maging katulad niya. So, iisipin mo, wala siyang maitim yung budhi niya, ganyan. Pero kung ikaw kasi yung lumaki sa ganung environment, teachers mo, lola mo, auntie mo, nanay mo, kapatid mo, ay sinasabi sa yung siya yung pinakamagaling na presidente, of course, it will also form an idea in your head. Not all people can go beyond their own social circles, study in Manila, get to know many friends outside of Manila, and then have their perspectives, counter-checked by people. So, hindi tayo lahat may ganun kasi. Alright, so lastly, ito na, be patient. Okay, so sinabi ko kanina, always engage with humility and dignity. So, wag mong hayaang binabastos-bastos ka. You stand your ground. Sabihin mo, Uncle, hindi naman po tamang sabihin mo sa akin, hindi ako marunong pumili ng presidente dahil babae ako. Hindi naman po yata tama yun. So, you stand your ground in a respectful and humble manner. Right? So, you always think about your purpose for why you're doing this in the first place. Bakit ako nag-engage ng kapwa ko botante? Nag-engage ako ng kapwa ko botante because I feel passionate about these certain topics that other presidentiables don't even care about. So, of course, I want the president that I'm supporting, who is also supporting the same things that I am, to win. So, sobrang personal nito sa akin, etc. So, we all have very different reasons for why we're engaging with different voters. Always think about that and use that as fuel and driver for you to keep moving forward. Alright, so isa siya si RBG, the late RBG, isang tanyag na abogado at isang tanyag na feminista. So, Syempre, hindi ko sinabi yung nakapag-type ako ng here's one of my favorite quotes of all time, pero hindi ko nilagay yung quote, di ba? Wala lang. So, ang sinabi ni RBG, fight for what you believe in, but do it in a way that will lead others to join you. Again, fight for what you believe in, but do it in a way that will lead others to join you. So, and you can only do that if you do it with humility and dignity. Okay, so yun yung aking presentation. Maraming salamat sa pakikinig. Sana may natutunan ka.
Yes,
And
maraming salamat
stop
po.
screen share.
Thank you,
Oh, di
Miss
ba natapos?
Yes, Miss Ash. Wow. Yes.
So we're now opening for the forum for questions. Tama ba, Jo?
Yes, Sir Joseph. So, kick off ko na yung pagtatanong or
Mabigat yung
pag-comment
matanong,
ba yan. Napakaganda yung point ni Ash kanina sa getting to know your audience. Oo nga naman kung makikipag-usap ka sa mga hindi mo kaparehas yung political view, paano mo sila i-engage? Tama yung if you have to know them, you get to know them, anong background ng pinanggalingan niya para yun yung i-target mo, kagaya nga nung example niya sa if the person has a different sexual orientation, for example, member ng LGBTQ, yun nga yung i-target mo para maging engaging at interesting yung pag-uusap nyo. And then, yung main takeaway ko rin na isa ay yung sa putting yourself in the shoes of others. Very applicable yun, lalo na sa atin dito sa Pilipinas, very emotional ang karamihan sa mga voters, no? Ang daming, a lot of them would go at great lengths to defend their candidates, even to the point of, giving below the belt remarks, ad hominem attacks, mga ganyan. So nawawala na dun sa usapin, yung tunay na usapin. Ano ba yung mga importanteng usapin sa politika, kagaya ng ano nga ba ang mga plataporma nila and so on. So it's really a challenge and a struggle to be cool and level-headed in these encounters. So, anong masasabi mo, Ash? Paano natin i-engage yung mga ganong tao na kapag hindi na nila masagot yung tanong mo, or kapag hindi na nila na-defend yung kanilang mga kandidato, they resort to ad hominem attacks and below the belt remarks.
Yeah. Well, actually, I've had two different kinds of responses to that. First, it's reminding them that, hey, that's actually against the law. Because if you're trying to tell me all of these things that are below the belt, that are bullying in nature, then we have laws for that, like the cyberbullying law. We also have admin cases for that. I've used the admin case card before because we also have different people holding government positions, elected government positions, target me on Facebook because of the kinds of posts that I make. So, like, nabag po yan sa administrative code, civil code ng Pilipinas. So that's one, reminding them that there are other ways to engage that will not make you go against the law. Second is, unfortunately, I've had moments where I had to block red because the comments were really, I can stomach some of the comments. I'll give you one scenario. So I have a relative. Of course, I'm from Ilocos, so you all know. I'm not going to name names, but you all know that in this region, many people will support this candidate, right? So, lagi sinasabi na ganyan kasi kayo sa UP, kasi mula nung nag-aral ka dyan, ganyan ka na brainwash ka, ganyan. Siya yung pinakamagaling na presidente. And then nag-reply ako ng, uncle, kahit naman dito sa NUS din, ganyan din naman yung tingin sa kanya. Tapos biglang sinabi niya na, so ngayon, dahil diyan ka nag-aaral, nagmamayabang ka na, ang yabang-yabang mo. Ganon talaga yung klase ng mga comment. Hindi naman ako yung naunang mag-mention ng educational background. Nireplyan ko lang din naman. Tapos aside from that, nagpaparinig na siya sa mga individual posts niya sa Facebook. Like, yung mga babaeng walang jowa, ganyan, mga hindi pa mag-asawa, kaya mainit yung ulo kasi wala pang asawa. Like, and everybody knows it's about me kasi ako yung galit siya sa akin. Tapos, binan ako siya, especially nung iiyak ko yung nanay ko na, anak, tigil mo na yung kapost-post mong ganyan. Kasi ayokong nakikita yung mga kamag-anak natin ginaganyan-ganyan ka. Sabi ko, oo ma, ititigil ko na. Ibig sabihin, ititigil ko lang mag-engage sa kanya. Block. Hindi lagi, tigil ko lang mag-engage sa kanya. Block. Para hindi na din, wala din masasaktan nanay ko. So, tapos na yung problema, di ba? So, anong point nitong dalawang kinds of engagement? So, ang point nito ay, people who disagree with you will also be varied. There are people who disagree with you who are disagreeing with you because, tawag dito, they are already super fans of this political candidate. Na hindi na talaga mababago yung isip nila. Talagang, gano'n, blank pa rin. Or may iba naman nagdi-disagree sa'yo. Kasi, according to the kinds of information that they see, hindi nagtutugma yung sinasabi mo. And they are open, right, to talking about it. And those are the kinds of people who just have to provide an alternative information. We just have to remind about accessing different kinds of sources. And you also have to remind about the kinds of laws that have already been passed. And there are already laws and court decisions regarding the stolen wealth of this certain political family, etc. So, ganun lang. At the end of the day, it's just about discerning who you are engaging, their differences, and then acting from there.
Ash, I share the sentiment, kasi we are from the same part of the Philippines.
Where?
Taga-Abra.
Oh my God. Ilocana.
Nahipintas,
Ilocana.
Yeah, we all know na, they prefer, we are the minorities, kumbaga. They prefer this one person to be, So, to the point na, even within your family talaga, may makakabangga ka when you start talking about your political opinions. So so pwede in that line or along that line, related siya sa question po ni Doc Louie. So on families having different political backgrounds. So pwede po nating ipasok si Doc Louie.
Hi Ash, magandang hapon. Well, I would just like to pick on your discussion about relationships and how political stands really are personal, and how we should also protect ourselves one way or another. And this is also in relation to the previous discussion, yung nabanggit mo lang a while ago. Kasi I'm really fascinated with the dynamics between family members. And we've seen many cases of this being highlighted in different social media platforms wherein they would say na nag-away na naman sila ng magulang niya because of different political stand, or they would say I do not share the political stand of my parents, or that magkakaiba kami ng sinusuportahan sa pamilya. So I'm just wondering how, or what would be your suggestions, advice to young voters, especially to the young voters who would want to keep their stand and would want to avoid being swayed by their parents without necessarily severing relationships with their family members. Yung iba, mahirap para sa kanila siguro na talagang harapan at direktang sumuway. Kasi they're still young and they're still provided by their family. But deep within themselves, they know that what they're thinking is correct and would want to stand for it. So what would be your suggestions to these young voters? Thank you, Ash.
Pero actually, ramdam ko din yan. Lalo nung 2016 also, I was a first-time voter last 2016. Tapos, of course, magkakaiba kami ng sinusuportahan. Pero ngayon, everything changed because I'm also a breadwinner in my family. And so my parents listen to me because I'm also a breadwinner. And my younger siblings also listen to me because I also support them. So iba na yung dynamic. So I get what Doc Louie is asking, especially if you're a student. You're basically powerless, diba? Kasi nakatira ka doon, hindi ka pa kumikita ng sarili mong pera, hindi ka pwedeng i-kick out, hindi ka pwedeng gawing parya sa pamilya kasi you hindi ka pa makakatayo sa sarili mong paa ngayon. So, gamitin natin ang magandang world ng social media actually. So, there are a lot of support groups on social media. Okay? And in those support groups, you will see how different people from different backgrounds are what they're doing and how they're responding with their situation. And you can learn a lot from them by engaging with them. Kasi I felt this way back in 2016 and now it's really so different. So having a support system is easier. It will make everything easier as compared to when you're just dealing with it alone. And lahat nga, for example, ng inspirational speeches ng mga kandidato na sinusuportahan mo, at the end of the day, they will say, sama-sama natin gagawin ito. Kasi it's an unquestionable fact, right? Na pag may kasama ka, kakayanin mo yan. So, napakarami yan. Thankfully, yan yung isa sa mga goods na naibigay sa atin ng social media ngayon. So, meron yan sa kahit saang platform. TikTok, Twitter, Instagram, you just have to look at the hashtag. You just have to attend different fora being conducted by volunteers, etc.
Pero very interesting po yung point out nyo and sa experiences din namin sa social media. Gusto ko lang marinig siguro yung opinion nyo, Ash, kung ano yung sa tingin mo yung idea ng parasocial relationship. Ito yung parang na-obserbahan ngayon sa social media na mas malapit yung feeling natin sa mga nakikita natin sa social media, sa yung epekto ng mga profiles ng mga politiko. For example, pag binastos mo yung isang politiko, parang binabastos mo na yung isang kamag-anak mo, even though hindi ever mo siya nakilala in person. So, para natin ito malalampasan, nabanggit mo rin sa presentation mo yung information asymmetry. And sa tingin mo ba yung information na ito, hindi nagre-respond ang mga tao palagi sa facts, nagre-respond sila sa beauty. Kung maganda yung presentation, kahit wala siya sa basis of facts, mas gusto niyang lapitan. So, nakakibat rin yung idea na yung retorika is hindi palaging logical. And minsan emotional investment na lang. Kaya minsan, paano natin ma-overcome yung gano'n yung sinasabi nilang gambler's fallacy ba yun? Yung emotionally invested na yung ibang tao sa kanilang mga politikong napili na kahit anong pagkakamaling gawin, lalo silang naging resilient, lalo silang pinagtitibay nila yung sarili nila sa mga ebidensya na nais mo ipakita sa kanila.
Ayan. Ang specific ng question ni Sir Joseph at ang ganda. So dahil ang ganda at ang specific ng question niya, mag-name drop na din ako ng kandidato because it's also by showing and breaking down their rhetoric and their branding that you can answer actually the question. So a while ago, I mentioned about responding to this person using administrative cases that he might commit. Dahil sa mga kinokomment niya sa akin kasi SK person ito ay SK officer ka tapos kung ano-anong kinokomment mo sa mga post ko na hindi naman tungkol sa'yo. Tapos sabi niya, nung sinabi kong pwede akong kasuhan, actually, tapos bigla siya nagme-message ng, oy, sorry na, kasi sinabi mo kasi magnanakaw si Marcos. Bakit mo sinabi magnanakaw si Marcos? Hindi magnanakaw si Marcos. So parang, grabe naman, hindi naman ikaw yung sinabihan ko. Bakit ikaw yung nasasaktan? So Ilocano, hamit nga panggap ka niya, apay nga masilian ka. Hindi niya sabi ko sa kanya. Kasi sobrang dahil nga magkakaiba ng pinagagalingan sa Pilipinas, archipelago siya, napakaraming ethnic groups diyan. Kung sino yung tumatakbong parehas mo ng ethnicity, kamiyama mo ng ethnic group, ang lakas nung mo, 'di ba? Sense of oneness. Ang lakas ng relatability niya sa'yo. Pero para ma-breakdown mo 'yon, actually i-breakdown mo first, hindi lang naman siya tumatakbo bilang presidente ng mga Ilocano, pero tumatakbo siya bilang presidente ng Pilipinas. Kasi sometimes, different people will say, bumatok siya, uunlad ang Ilocos, ganyan. Hindi nga umunlad ang Ilocos in the past. Matagal na yan sila. Paano pa ngayon? At hindi naman isolated ang Ilocos from the Philippines. If you have a bad administration who can handle the problems of the Philippines, then that will cascade down to your own family in Ilocos. Pangalawa, hindi perfect yung association. Hindi kayo magkatulad. Una, hindi kayo parehas na laki sa yaman. Hindi kayo parehas na nakapag-aral using own money sa iba't ibang mga tanyag na universidad sa ibang bansa. Kahit kung ikaw, lahat ng bagay gagawin mo para makapagtapos, magpuyat ka man, magtrabaho ka man, bayaran mo lang yung tuition mo, gagawin mo. Yung iba nga, andyan na lahat sa kanila, hindi pa rin nagtapos. So, hindi kayo parehas. So it's just breaking down that sense of sameness with that person. Hindi kayo parehas, period. Actually, I appreciate the speech of BPN because I just finished watching all of the speeches in the campaign kickoff of all of the presidential candidates. It was only Lenny Robredo who said, Bicolano ako, pero hindi ko hinihingi ang boto nyo dahil lang Bicolano ako. Huwag niyo ako iboto dahil Bicolano ako. In the Philippines, being a member of these certain ethnicities is already a political capital for you. I remember when she ran for vice presidency in 2016. And Cheese Escudero also was running as vice president in 2016. Binantagang basag boto si VP Lenny noon. Kasi naunang mag-declare ng intention si Cheese Escudero and they're both from Bicol region. Pangalawa, yung sa question ni Sir Joseph, even if for example, people will vote more based on their emotional response. The kinds of information that they will have, pandering to their emotions, will also be different. Have you heard of the phrase, Tigre sa Norte? Yes, diba? Sino hindi pa I know, baka hindi naman lahat kayo nakarinig yun, pero Tigre sa Norte, angas, diba? So, kahit na nag-respond ka kung gano'ng kaangas yun, hindi naman lahat tayo narinig yung information na yun kasi that kind of phrase doesn't reach us now. Okay? And our appreciation of Tigre sa Norte, Tigre Aguila will also be different. Tigre sa Norte can be interpreted very differently. Una, strength. Right? Strength eh. Pangalawa, destiny. Right? Kasi Year of the Tiger ngayon, it's your time, destiny mo to, etc. Yung agila sa Davao, yung mga ganyan. Ano ang sinisimbolo nun? It means soaring high, babangon muli, di ba? It also panders to like your sameness, your rootedness in this certain geographical area in the Philippines where Philippine eagles are known to exist. So that kind of rhetoric and imagery, of course, people will respond differently, but that kind of rhetoric will also be differently available and differently interpreted by people. So, ang dami kong gusto na lang narinig. Kung ano-anong interpretation ng pink, di ba, ng rosa, sinagsasabing, kasi pag yung red, nilagyan mo ng white, purity, magiging pink. Sabi ko, okay. Meron din nagsasabing, kasi sa psychology, ang pink daw has been used to counter violence para mangpakalma. So, in a very chaotic world, ang pink daw ginagamit ng color para pakalmahin yung mga tao. Pink daw yung kulay ng twilight. Dapat hapon, nag-aagaw ang liwanag at dilim. Diba, sa campaign rally ni VP Lenny, ang last song doon, liwanag sa dilim. So, sobrang different ng interpretation based on the kind of information accessible to them. And yes, people will respond emotionally also, but that's not necessarily wrong. Because at the end of the day, our emotions are coming from very personal, private experiences, which are by themselves very political. You cannot say my personal love life is not political because who I choose to love by how much will also be determined by the kinds of politics I subscribe to. So,
Tamang-tama
ganun.
sa Valentine's.
Wow.
Galing, di ba?
Very well said.
Sa Valentine's.
Kasi ano mo, mga eme talaga mga... Tsaka, ikaw hot ba to? Very
Parang
good
sasabi mo,
comment.
Ash, ang advice natin sa mga tao na gusto natin kausapin sa politika, parang advice natin sa mga friends natin na ayaw iwanan yung ano nila na boyfriend or girlfriend na
Nice
toxic.
one. Yeah.
Oo, kasi relationship. Actually,
Ayaw
ito ang
mag-let
sad.
go.
Yung best friend ko, sobrang nasasad ako. Kasi yung best friend ko, sobrang vocal niya. Kasi yung best friend ko ay healthcare worker. Na wala pang, by the way, special risk allowance.
Oh.
So, sobrang namulat talaga siya ng pandemya eh. Kasi may mga colleagues siya na nag-volunteer sa Bayanihan e-Consulta ni VP Lenny. At talagang sobrang personal, sobrang like one-on-one interaction, like nakakasalubuhan nila si VP Lenny. Natatanong sila, na kumain ka na ba? Ilang oras ka ba natulog? Magpahinga ka muna, mga ganyan. Na hindi mo makikita sa ibang mga tumatakbo ngayon. So anyway, naging mas vocal siya. Nagko-comment ba naman yung kapatid niya? Nasabi kahit daw manalo si Lenny by 100-fold, at the end of the day, magdidildil pa rin naman daw sila ng asin. Kahit sino daw manalo, hindi naman magbabago yung buhay nila. So, yung disconnect, yung inability to see how your personal, most private life is connected to the most public political issues. Yung hindi mo makita yung connection, that's a tragedy. Sobrang tragedy niya ngayon. So, yung love life, dyan nakaka-connect yung mga utaw na feeling nila sobrang private, personal, pero hindi. I-connect natin yan sa politika kasi connected talaga yan sa politika.
Ang susunod na magtatanong is si Doc Jovi.
Ano kaya yung post-election na relationship or interaction ng mga magkakaibigan? Na lalo na yung magkakaiba yung kanilang pananaw pampolitika. Kung magkakampi kayo sa bahay, halimbawa sa amin, dito sa bahay, Bicolano ako, no? Kaya alam niyo na kung ano yung pinag-uusapan namin dito. Kahit yung mama ko na 85 years old, wala ibang bukang bibig kundi yung siyempre yung kapwa namin Bicolana, no? Pero to sa pamilya o sa mga kaibigan na magkakaiba talaga, paano kaya ito? Talaga bang sa tingin mo sa perspective mo, makakasira ba talaga ito tuluyan ng relationship? Dahil politika lang ito, it comes once every, sabi natin 6 years at most, or 3 years, pagka midterm election. Dahil politics lang ito, makakalimutan lang ito. No? So, gaano ba ka-critical or ka-relevant sa mga Pinoy yung kanilang political differences pagdating dun sa kanilang social relationships?
Ayan. Ang tanong ni Sir Job, kasi ang complex at complicated kasi nung relationships at social interactions and how we maintain that. Diba? Suppose elections, kapag nakipag-away ba kami ng kaibigan ko dahil sa differences in voting preferences, ay magkakaibigan pa rin kami after ng elections. Actually, sir, it depends. Kasi you also have people who used to support so a certain presidential candidate way back in 2016 who also realized that, oh my God, I made a mistake. And they were open about the kind of mistake that they made. So they were able to reconnect with the kinds of people that they lost before the elections. Right? But there are also people who will stand by their choices last 2016 and, will just bear it under the rug na tapos na yan, pass na yan, hindi na ako mag-sorry dyan, so tapos na, iwan ko na yan. So it depends also. It also depends if the kinds of policies will negatively affect your friendship and your family and your friend and your circle of friends after the elections. Different presidents will push for different policies that will differently affect your circle. So, kapag yung policy niya anti-poor, at relatively middle class naman kayo, hindi naman exactly nararamdaman yung consequence ng pagboto sa presidente na ito, malamang hindi magiging malakas yung drive nyo to serve as checks and balances for each other. Hindi mo sasabihin na ikaw kasi sabi ko na kasi huwag mo iboto kasi hindi nyo na nararamdaman yung negative consequences ng boto na yun. Kasi party yun ng middle class at anti-poor yung mga policies na yung mga mahihirap talaga yung mga naaapektuhan. So, Sir Joel, we can say for sure it will depend on who is going to win. It will depend also on the kinds of policies that winning president will put forward. And of course, your personal characteristic na din bilang mga magkakaibigan. Kasi isa lang na, I mean, yung ibang mga kandidato kasi they thrive on polarization. So even if they go out there professing unity, manifesting unity, you also know that they are funding and they're actually driving very aggressive, very insulting and inflammatory trolls behind that because they thrive in black and white. They thrive in polarization. So, kapag nanalo yung mga ganong president, mahirap talagang, kausap kayo.
Yeah. Actually, mas malalim actually yung differences doon sa local level kaysa sa presidente.
Oo, sir. Kasi,
diba? Mas madugo doon. Kasi ang naglalaban actually kuminsan doon, magkakaibigan. Hindi na magkakaibigan, magkakapamilya. Sa national, pwedeng makalimutan pero pagdating sa local, mahirap, malalim. Kuminsan, hindi lang yung differences, kuminsan nag-iiwan ng sugat sa pamilya. Kaya yun ang medyo masalimbot minsan pagdating sa local election. Kultura siguro talaga ng Pilipino yung ganong klase ng Kaya ako minsan sinasabi ko sa kanila, sa mga kamag-anak ko, politika lang yan. Pero syempre, sa iyo politika lang, sa kanila, hindi yung buhay nila yun
True, sir.
Diba?
Talaga, kapag barangay level talaga yan, mga barangay captain, kasi di ba pag nagtatay yan, hindi na, wala nang bunutan na lang. Kapag may tayo ka sa barangay level, toss coin ka or kung ano yung mas mahabang stick pag nabunot mo, ikaw na ang barangay captain. So minsan talaga, yung mga ibang boto, parang talagang singilan kita. Yung singilan talaga silang, sabi ko na kasi sa'yo, dapat hindi yung binoto yan. Kasi yun yung malapit sa kanila. Kasi kung may nag-away kayo may nagsisigawan ng mga marites or mayroon kang kapitbahay na kung anong pinagkakalat tungkol sa'yo, ang unang level dyan, barangay captain. Diba? And even our laws, like for example, the violence against women and children, actually also encourages and even requires you to go to the barangay level, barangay captain, and then your barangay health and women's desk first. Yun yung pinakamalapit sa'yo. Maramdam na ramdam mo. So imagine if nakikita natin yung personal life natin na sobrang connected sa very national public politics. Makakaboto tayo ng mas maayos sa halalan.
Ayan, tama yan, ma'am. Lalo na din sa atin po, Alam mo naman sa atin, sa probinsya natin, madugo pa nga pagkatapos. Hindi lang during or before the election, pagkatapos madugo pa rin. Kaya very far-reaching yung implication ng mga political stance ng bawat pamilya. So, pagpatuloy po natin ang talakayan, ibigay ko po kay Ma'am Flor, Doc Flor, ang katanungan.
Maraming salamat po. Gusto ko lang i-validate kasi lagi akong concerned dun sa tanong na paano makikipag-communicate. Yung public sphere naman, nakadalawang public intellectuals na ako na nakarinig na dapat may philosopher sa presidential interview. Kasi parating journalist, nasa economics, political science, lahat sa social sciences andon maliban sa, humanities ang philosophy. Pero hinahanap pala tayo. So medyo kinilig ako doon, no? Pero anong mangyayari kaya sa amin kapag kasama kami sa panel na yun? Makakagat ba nila yung mga tanong na, what's happiness? Diba? Of the good. So, kung yung dalawang public intellectual na yun ang nagsabi na kailangan nga kami dun sa public discourse na ganyan na napakahalaga, kakadgatin ba talaga? What's your take on that yun? Thank you.
Kaya nga, ma'am. Actually, yan din yung una kong naisip nung nakita ko yung invite. Kasi sobrang daming ginagawa, dami ko ding work, tapos sobrang busy. Pero parang, meron kang professional association ng mga philosophers sa Pilipinas na nag-i-invite, which is very new. So, go tayo. So, curious din ako kung anong take niyo actually sa napakaraming mga political happenings sa Pilipinas. And now that you mentioned it, yung curiosity na yon is actually not just curiosity from my personal view, pero meron para siyang national consequence na wala nga ako nakikita mga philosophy people na nagtatanong sa presidential interviews. Actually, yan din yung struggle before because I remember when I was an undergraduate in sociology, a lot of my professors were also saying, my God, why don't they interview sociologists? And now, thankfully, they are actually getting more sociologists to talk about different happenings in the 2022 elections. Kasi sobrang social din eh. You also see the battle out in terms of social relationships. And sociologists can talk more about that. I know we know that this is where our strengths lie, and we appreciate how the media is now giving us space to discuss what we know. So, aminin ko din because I haven't been seeing a lot of people from philosophy in the discussions surrounding the presidential elections. Meron ding meron kasi mga interviews na bordering on philosophy, right? What does happiness mean to you? Yung mga kanyang tanong. Actually, the interview with Boy Abonta by the presidential host actually asked a lot of these questions. The questions were not as political, as direct, and as precise as that of Jessica Soho in her interview. So, dapat nakumuha sila ng mga philosophy people doon. Pero nagtatanong din sila talaga ng mga tanong na kailangan ng comments from philosophers, diba? Pag ipinikit yung, anong na-imagine yung itsura ng Pilipinas after 6 years? Right? Actually, napaka-philosophical din ng tanong na yun. At lagi ko itong sinasabi sa mga estudyante, kung meron tayo mga big questions na sobrang intimidating, pero actually, araw-araw natin sinasagot. Like, who am I? Who am I? Which is a very philosophical question, di ba? Pero araw-araw mo yung sinasagot. Like, for example, you choosing what to wear every day, it's already a philosophical answer to that very big philosophical question. Kasi magsusuot ka ng sleeveless, sasabihin mo, ay, parang hindi ako to. So, magpapalit ka ng damit. Diba? Or magsusuot ka ng pink. Tapos sasabihin mo, ay, parang hindi ito nag-reflect sa moral values ko. Or magsusuot ka ng red. So, magpapalit ka. Sinasagot mo yun everyday. So, baka akala ng mga tao, ang philosophy, wala siya sa everyday life. Na sobrang big lang siya. Pero actually, meron siya sa everyday life natin. At yun yung kailangan natin realize.
Pampatapang siya, 'di ba? Kasi yung smart shaming nandyan. So pag nagsalita ang isang nag-aaral ng filosofiya, tali-talinuhan, may mga ganon, o ikaw na yung logical, kaaway, elitista, hindi naman ang filosopo, mayaman, hindi naman kami may
Totoo. Tsaka yung mga iba talaga, hindi na sinasagot yung tanong, di ba? Sa mga presidential interviews. Like, sobrang fallacious na mga sagot.
Insulto nga po ang pilosopo, di ba, sa lingwahe ng Pilipino. Pamimilosopo ka na naman. Ay, may tanong po yata si Doc Johnny.
Napakaganda itong conversation na ginagawa natin kasi I'm listening from, a young one like you, no? Pero isa lang tanong ko na experience ko kasi na parang yung tinatawag na destiny. Paano mo sinasagot ang mga kausap na hindi rason ang pinanggagalingan? Halimbawa, itong mga sinabi ko kanina, yung destiny, yung personal experience ko sa mga engagement ko sa mga voters. Pero parang nawawala talaga yung tinatawag nating rational discourse. Would you give us some techniques? May technique ba sa pakikipag-engage mga ganito?
Ayan. Actually, alam mo kapag ginamit mo yung line of argument nila sa kanila, lalo silang magagalit. Diba? Kasi for example, sasabihin nilang, bakit ba ang dami mong daldal? Hindi ka pa naman buhay nung panahon na yun. Wala ka namang alam. Sasabihin mo, ikaw nga naniniwala ka sa Diyos, hindi ka naman nabuhay nung panahon na yun or something. Or kapag sabihin nilang, shut up ka na lang, masyado ka pang bata. Makinig ka sa akin ngayong election. Tapos ginagawa ko lang dyan, sir, pero hindi ko alam if effective ko sa lahat. Ay, pinapoint out ko kung ano yung mali doon sa line of argument nila. So, pag sinabi mong destiny siya, sabihin mo, okay, kung destiny lang ang basihan ng tatakbong presidente, bakit tayo bumoboto? Ba't din na lang mismo ipanganak bilang presidente yung tao? Diba? And some people really think that they are born to become the president, that the presidency is their entitlement. At hindi pwede yun. But then, so pointing out, like, where the statement, breaks down. So, hindi nagko-connect itong statement na to. Kung ayaw niyo makinig at kung sobrang bad faith ng pag-engage niya, nagsistop na po ako. So, hindi na ako po. Iniisip ko din yung mental health.
Thank you, Ash, for that. Thank you.
Yung problem of language na kapag nagsalita yung mga nasa social media, ang nako-cover lang talaga niyang scope, nasa class A and B. So parang parang it's just a vicious cycle of messages na talagang hindi naman nakakaabot sa lower classes. May ganong perspective po kasi. Ang ibig ba sabihin nito, ang tamang voters education ay talagang yung bumababa sa grassroots. Pandemic ngayon, di ba? So kung ikaw ay nasa social media at kahit anong effort mo ay laging may comment na ay pang class A and B na yan, tsaka may mga desisyon na yung mga taong yan, paano tayo bababa dun sa laylayan o kaya dun sa ground na sinasabi nila? Okay na sana kung walang COVID di ba? Comdev ka, sa parokya, pero ngayon kasi di ba, para tayo napilayan tapos saklay natin teknolohiya.
Actually, dahil si Sir Julio Teehankee ang isa pang voter, yan tuloy, napagbibig ko ng word, ay isa pang guest ninyo. I know Sir July is very much against pushing for only voters education. Kasi parang naniniwala siyang ang responsibilidad ay nasa ating lahat at hindi lang nasa mga botante. So, yan kasi yung imagery na nabuo sa atin na laging kailangan natin bumaba kasi ang problema nasa baba. Ang kailangan ng education yung mga nasa laylayan, bumaba tayo. Pero sobrang blinding nung argument na yun. Para kang, taga-vegan ako, so kung naisip ko yung kalesa, yung meron kang nakaganon ka sa kalesa, para isa lang yung makita mo. Pero actually, marami pang underlying issues dyan. So una, pag sinabi ko kailangan na bumaba sa laylayan, actually, a lot of people who are very vocal online are also themselves part of those from the lower socioeconomic classes. And I mean, my own family, kahit na, syempre, English tayo dito at sa Pilipinas, unfortunately, pag English ka, tingin sa'yo mayaman ka. Actually, no. Yung tatay ko ay isa siya sa mga nawalan ng trabaho nung pandemya kasi bus conductor. Tapos, yung nanay ko ay public school teacher. Kaya ngayon, nagkaroon ako ng power sa family because I also financially contribute to my family already. Dahil hindi kayo nung college na more live off ka lang from the scholarship money. So, yung pagbaba ng laylayan, parang ako din ako naniniwala dyan. Kasi, parte na tayo mismo dun Tumingin ka lang sa paligid mo. Hindi mo kailangang bumaba. Tumingin ka lang sa paligid mo. Pwede na yun. Tsaka, hindi na ako naniniwala ngayon na ang mga may access lang, ang mga nakakarinig lang sa'yo sa social media ay yung mga mayayaman. Kasi may mga, dahil sa pandemya nga, nakapag-force siya ng investment sa technology sa iba't ibang mga kabahayan. So nakapag-force out siya ng investment sa iba't ibang mga kabahayan. Meron ka ng free access to technology. Meron ka ng free Facebook. So if you use the interface of Facebook, right, you will actually reach a broader audience. So paano mo gagawin yun? Mag-like ka lang ng mga Facebook pages nila. 'Di ba? Tapos join ka sa mga Facebook group para yung nakikita mo sa newsfeed mo ay yung mga tao ding naniniwala doon sa mga pinaglalike mo. Right? So, mas nakakakita ka ng mga tao. At dahil nga, namamatch na ng Facebook, yung kinds of activities na meron kayong dalawa, yung mga post mo, nakikita na din nila. So, nakalabas ka na din doon sa echo chamber mo. Pero alam mo ma, mistake kasi na i-downplay yung importance ng social media engagement. Mistake siya. Kasi may mga nananalong presidente na hindi man nang nag-field the work. May mga tumatakong presidente na kasama ng mga tao nakachinelas kapag bagyo andon at kasama ng mga tao nagbubuhat ng tubig. Pero may mga nananalo ding mga hindi man lang nakisalamuha sa tao at nasa social media lang. So, huwag natin i-downplay ang power ng social media.
Interesting yan kasi ang binabasa ko naman ngayon si I'm not sure kung familiar kay Müller, Hans Georg Müller. Pero ginagamit ng sociologist si Niklas Luhmann, tapos yung idea niya ng second order observation na habang tumatagal nagkaano tayo sa mga profiles nga pati yung social media. Tapos yung Filipino is parang petri dish ng mga democracies with how social media is really important kasi nga sa Filipino diaspora na doon nagko-communicate yung mga head of families nila. So, siguro isa ring parte is napapansin ko rin na mas mabilis mag-convert ng idea ng tao pag kausap mo siya ng personal diba? Pero pag mas mabilis kasi maging masama or cruel sa kapwa mo pag hindi mo nakikita ng personal. For example, mas mabilis siyang tawanan, mas mabilis siyang murahin pag hindi mo nakikita ng personal.
Totoo yan.
Paano kaya natin pagdudugtungin yun? Kasi nakikita natin na yung trend na papunta na nga sa social media yung presentation ng politika natin. Pero at the same time, mahirap rin, mabilis kumapit sa mga prejudices pag nasa social media.
Gusto ko yung si Niklas Luhmann, sociologist of modernity. So, sobrang niya, relevant. Pero nag-agree ako na mas madaling murahin. Kasi, siya, disembodied thought. Parang nadadala ka lang ng sarili mong emosyon. Tapos sa baka disembodied, hindi mo siya nakikita, hindi mo na-realize yung very material na dulot niya sa'yo. At dulot niya sa ibang mga tao. So, ano gagawin natin doon? Ang gagawin natin doon, always put yourself na dun sa position nila. Kasi kung ikaw din yung nakaka-receive ng ganung mga klase ng reaction, gusto mo din ba yun? But hindi naman dahil hindi mo nakikita yung, at hindi naman dahil sa social media siya naganap, ay hindi na siya damaging. Kasi yung harshness ng word ay andun pa rin. Hindi naman siya nawawala. Whether sinabi mo siya in person or not. Pag in person, totoo yan na hindi rin kayo, ang hirap pa siya mag-away in person, di ba? Merong tema yan ng mga kabataan, bardagulan. Ay, ba yung bardagulan? Yung bardagulan yung talaga kayo, away-away kayo for the smallest of things. Ay, talaga yung bardagul talaga kayo. Bardagul na parang sobrang trivial ng mga bagay. Tapos pinag-aawayan-awayan nyo. At madaling gawin yun. Kasi online kayo. Pero pag nakikita-kita kayo in person, magkatawanan lang kayo na, my God, ito yung pinag-awayan natin, no?
Last question ni Doc Johnny siguro kasi gumagabi na dito sa chat.
Sa voters na DNE, so, class DNE, tama ba itong gamiting classification sa election? Ay, maganda tong tanong na to.
Yes.
Is it fair?
Ito na ang philosophical question ko sa inyo. Anong ibig sabihin ng tama? Anong tama? Ano ang mali? Pero valid siya. Ito ang masasabi ko. Valid siya. Kasi magkakaiba yung voting preferences ng ibang mga taong galing sa different socio-economic classes. At kung ikaw yung tumatakbo, gusto mo mag-pander dito sa mga taong nasa laylayan kasi malaki yung population na yun. Yung number nila ay madadala ka sa tagumpay. So, valid siya sa polls. Pero kung tama o mali, ay kayo na ang makakasagot niyan. Valid siya sa eleksyon kasi gusto mong manalo at gusto mong mag-reflect yung platform mo, yung narrative at yung branding mo doon sa kung anong hinahanap ng mga taong boboto sa'yo.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
So, that ends our balitaktakan and talakayan. Maraming salamat po ulit, Miss Ash, sa iyong mga sharing and discussion. So, we will now go to our awarding a certificate of appreciation to our dear speaker for today. Philippine National Philosophical Research Society and Isip Boto awards the Certificate of Appreciation to Miss Athena Sharan Ash R. Presto in gratitude for generously sharing their wisdom in the May Papel ba ang Pamimilosopiya sa eleksyon at ano ito? A PNPRS Isip Boto joint webinar on voters education held on February 12, 2022 at 2 p.m. via Facebook and YouTube. Signed by Flordelis Altes Albela, PhD, Isip Boto Convener, Job Jim S. Aguas, PhD, PNPRS Executive Governor, and Juan Rafael G. Macaranas, PhD, PNPRS Chairman. So here is your virtual certificate of appreciation, Ash. Let's give her po a round of applause.
Yay! Congratulations!
Maraming salamat po.
Maraming salamat.
At see you po sa mga susunod na event.
Maraming salamat, Ash.
Thank you po.
Tatanggol. Yung mga abogado.
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 Manananggol.
Manananggol.
Anong tawag sa mga sumisipol?
Maninipol.
Ayun. Paano ba, bakit ganyan mag-isip yung mga Pilipino? Paano ba ma-introduce yung rational discourse? Tiyempo-tiyempo, ng mga panahon na yan, pinag-isipan ko, under fire ang rational discourse. Ang mga scientists ng pandemic, natataranta. Teka mo na, huwag niyo kaming madaliin. Tapos may scientist ang World Health Organization, sabi, walang epekto yung mask. Maya-maya, uy, dapat mag-mask. Maya-maya, sabi naman ng gobyerno natin, dapat face shield. Tapos pagdating ko dito sa Roma, please remove your face shield. Di tabong ko naman. Para nakakalito. So ang mga scientists na supposed to be promoter of rational discourse, accumulated definitive studies, wala, natatarantang. Kaya yung iba, ang solusyon sa pandemic ay gobyerno, military, checkpoints. So nasaan dito yung rational discourse? Tapos ngayon, ang tanong ay panahon ng eleksyon. Paano bang bumoto yung mga tao? Bakit ganyan yung mga trends ng mga survey? Mapagkakatiwalaan ba yung survey? Mapagkakatiwalaan ba ang bakuna? Dapat turuan mag-isip ang mga Pilipino. Teka, sino yung magtuturo? May tiwala ba sila sa magtuturo? Sino pa ba ang pinagtitiwalaan ngayon? So talagang bara-bara. May cancel culture sa internet, may fake news, may alternative facts, may post-truth situation. So sabi mo nga, sa ganitong sitwasyon, paano rin ituturo ang rational discourse, ang philosophy? So dito sa ganitong sitwasyon, talagang malaki ang hamon sa filosofiya. Sa mga nakikita nating mga webinars na konektado sa eleksyon, mapapansin mo, may mga abogado, right? May mga economists, namamayagpag ng mga statisticians, yung mga nagpipresenta ng mga surveys. Merong konting labor, merong madaldal din yung ibang mga obispo, clergy, na namamayani din ang mga nasa communications. Yung magaling sa internet, sa Facebook, mag-live stream. Siyempre, yung mga journalists, mga rappler, mga ganyan. Meron ding ilang military, at siyempre, Maya-maya, sabi, kulang tayo ng mga artista, ng mga manganganta, composer, gumagawa ng video, singer, at saka ilang poeta. Parang wala pa akong nakitang philosophers. Saan pa sila Aristotle dito? Recruit nga natin si Kant o si Foucault o ganyan, no? Pwede mo nang sabihin, kasi yung mga abogado na yan, nag-aaral muna yan ng philosophy. Ganyan. Okay? Tinuruan lahat yan ng philosophy. Pero yung mga philosophy teachers, tsaka na lang. Ano kaya? Dito sa unang konteksto na to, gusto kong ipakita na mayroong bakante dito. At kung nagre-reklamo tayo na bakit ganyan ang pag-iisip ng mga tao, ano ba dapat ang pag-iisip? No? Katunayan, siyempre, nandoon naman ako sa diskusyon, sinisingit ko rin yung Pamimilosopiya. Katulad halimbawa, nung binubuo namin yung criteria sa pagpili ng sino ang i-endorse ang kandidato, siyempre, pag-uusapan mo dyan, yung ano yung hinahanap. No? Siyempre, ang bokabularyo dyan ay ano ba yung programa, plataforma sa gobyerno. Pero kahit maganda yung plataforma, baka pinagawa lang sa isang committee yan. Kailangan tignan mo rin yung pagkatao, di ba? Oo. Tapos kailangan mo rin tignan yung proseso ng mga pipili. Kung i-convert natin ito, siguro magandang sabihin, yung kontribusyon ng philosophers ay, hindi ba, pag pinag-usapan yung mga plataforma, we're talking about values. What are the important things? Hindi lang yan income, hindi lang yan bakuna, kundi yung pagpapahalaga sa tao. Kaya importante, laban tayo sa mga pagpatay. Di ba? So, values, pero sabihin, hindi naman pwedeng plataforma lang. Kailangan tignan mo rin yung tao. Kung mapagkakatiwalaan ka. So, pumapasok tayo sa larangan ng virtues. Ano ba ang tao? Ano ba ang mabuting tao? Ano ba ang katangian ng mabuting leader? Leader ng sabayanan. So, papasok na yung police, yung ang lipunan. Baka pwedeng merong magpaliwanag. Ano ba ang demo? Ano ba yung krasya? Demokrasya? Bakit paulit-ulit natin yung pinangalandakan? So, yung pinag-uusapan natin sa loob ng klase na virtues, values, arete, mga ganyan, technique, pwede nating ilapat na sabihin, meron din kami pwedeng sabihin dyan. Di ba? Kung ano. So siguro, importante lang na makita natin na pinag-uusapan dito ay plataforma, kandidato, ang pilosopo, matutunugan. I have something to say about that. We, philosophy, have something to say about that. Kaya nga, siguro dito, kahit pag-usapan yung eleksyon, merong panawagan. Sa totoo lang, I'm missing. We are missing, and the nation is missing the voice of rationality, philosophers. Pero at the same time, katulad ng mga pag-uusap sa public sphere, the philosophers, together with the scientists, they are all challenged to translate their technical terms, their technical ways of talking about things into a language that can circulate in a public space where you encounter different types of discourses. Lahat tayo, hinahamon. Yung mga statisticians, na magaling sa mga mathematics na ganyan, pagka nag-represent ng sa isang public seminar, inahanap nila yung pinakasimpleng paraan ng infographics na maintindihan ng tao yung sinasabi nila. Ganon din naman yung mga lawyers, ganun din naman. Kapag hindi ka maintindihan sa public space, sa public sphere, sabi nga ni Habermas, ang mangyari nun, iiwanan tayo. Lalo na kung philosopher, hindi naman tayo yung king. Sana, gusto kong sabihin na there's a space here which is really excited and in need of the voice of the philosophers and different philosophers. And I think philosophers have a lot to say.
Yung unang pumukaw sa akin yung tanong mo, bakit walang pilo sa mga ganong klase ng diskurso, di ba? Pag may conference sa PAP, puro mga philosophers, pagkatapos nun wala na. Sabi ko, laging nasa four walls lang tayo nag-uusap, pero pagdating doon sa public sphere, sino nakakakilala sa atin? Wala. Sa akin, tinitingnan ko palagi kasi yung, kagaya nyo na siguro, Father, yung cultural aspect ng mga, yung kultura ng mga Pilipino. Kaya siguro hirap silang makinig doon sa tinatawag nating rational discourse. Kasi pag nagsalita ka na ng medyo rational, at yung rational na yun naging parang kontra sa paniniwala nila or parang nakakasakit sa damdamin nila, parang ayaw na nilang pakinggan yun eh. Napaka-personal ng Pilipino, ayaw niya masaktan ng ano. At sa tingin ng marami siguro, yung philosophy kasi masyadong, yun nga, ang bias against yung kung ano yung rational. Kasi yung rational, lagi ang tingin nila, matayog, di ba? Abstract. At kung minsan, pag sinabing pilosopo, panggulo. Pero nga, tama yung sinabi niyo, Father, na kailangan ibaba natin yung diskurso doon sa level ng value, ng halaga. At sa tingin ko, magagawa ito kapag yung diskurso natin ay binaba natin doon sa ordinaryong karanasan ng mga tao. Kasi kung minsan, pagka nagsalita na yung mga pilosopo, ginamitan niya na ng mga matataas na salita, wala na. Yung lengguwahe pa lang, open na kaagad. Banggitin mo si Santo Tomas at saka si Aristotle, wala na. Tatahimik na yung iba. Pag nag-umpisa ka sa mga teorya, yung mga universal ideas, wala na, tapos ng usapan. Pero pag nag-umpisa ka doon sa karanasan ng mga tricycle driver, ng mga tambay, nung nasa bilyaran, kasi pagka idea agad, wala, sarado ka agad yung ano. Pag hindi natin inumpisan sa karanasan, hindi natin masasabi sa kanila kung ano yung mabuti, kung ano yung dignidad ng tao. Ang dignidad ng tao, nandun makikita mo sa pag pinapatay yung tao eh. Hindi naman pag diskurso mo tungkol kay Santo Tomas. Madagdag ko lang paano makakapasok talaga yung mga pilosopo doon sa usapan? Hindi nga kailangan diskurso eh. Doon sa usapan ng mga nasa baba.
Dalawa yung hamon eh. Isa, yung tayo mismo, paano tayo matututo? Hindi lang yung paano tayo makinig sa kanila. Salamat, Job. Kasi yung iba, binabaliwala lahat yung mga comment, yung mga nasa gilid ng mga screens. Kung minsan maganda rin pagtiyagaan ng tignan eh. At damahin natin kasi kapwa-tao din natin yan eh. Maraming literature sa internet tungkol sa banality of myth-making. Mas powerful yan eh. Tapos timing, unahan. Kung ikaw yung naunang nag-develop ng myth, yung mga mag-strong ka ng myth, naninira lang kayo. Kaya kung minsan unahan yan. Pagka pwedeng maganda yung ideya mo pero naunahan ka. So ang mangyayari, ikaw ngayon lumilitaw na critique o opposition o naninira.
Nagre-react ka na lang.
Nagre-react ka na lang.
First knowledge syndrome.
Kasi nga hindi ka hindi tayo kuminsan hindi tayo nakasakay ka agad sa totoong buhay. Kasi nga kumbaga normal sa atin na nag-iipon muna tayo ng maraming karanasan, tsaka nag-iipon ng maraming nababasa, tsaka tayo nagbumubuo ng reflection paper, di ba? Ito na. Bubuhusan ka ng mga readings, tapos ang requirement, reflection paper. Ganun eh. So, siguro isang hamon dito, hindi lang yung paano ba silang papaliwanagan, hindi paano ba ako makikinig sa kanila? Sabi nga kanina, si Socrates nakipag-inuman. Hindi gano'n. Maramdaman mo ano yung pinag-uusapan. Sa totoo lang yung mga komentaryo na yan, dati na yan eh. Pero nung dati, walang internet, nasa umpukan niya, nasa harap ng sari-sari store. Doon yung, doon yung mga hubs nila. So importante nga, we have to be engaged.
Maraming salamat sa pagpapaunlak nyo sa amin.
So, yun nga ho. Magandang short
Ayan.
mula kay Father. Sa susunod pa na mga araw, mag-release ang Isip Boto ng PNPRS nung iba pang parte ng usapan na yun.
Opo, na ang pinaka-tinatalakay nito ay ang kasagutan sa tanong na may papel nga ba ang pamimilosopiya sa eleksyon at ano ito? So, marami po abang-abang lang po tayo mga kapatid. Ayan. So, gusto ko rin pong i-plug kanina kasi may mga tanong po kay Ash. Video recording po kasi yung pinalabas natin kanina. So, hindi po niya masagot ng personal. So, kung gusto niyo po siyang tanungin, pwede niyo po siyang i-follow at mag-comment sa kanyang Twitter account. Socioloiha. H-I-J-A. So, Socioloiha. Opo. Yan po. Maraming salamat.
Pati yung may magtatanong rin sa membership ng PNPRS and ipopost yung link mamaya.
Ayan. So dito po sa... Yes po. So pwede po tayong mag-evaluate mamaya. Din po sa... sa YouTube ata, sir? Tama? Sa YouTube at saka sa Facebook?
Apa.
Yung link. Ayun.
Ang pagkakaintindi ko pa.
Okay. So maraming salamat po. Dahil nasa ending na po tayo ng ating webinar, maraming salamat po sa mga nandito pa. Mga nandito pa hanggang ngayon. Okay? So, who been with us until the end, we hope to engage again with you with another dialogue and conversation sa mga susunod po na webinars natin po. So, before po tayong maghuli, para po sa ating mensaheng pasasalamat at panghuling salita, tinatawag ko po ang ating PNPRS Treasurer, si Ginoong Alvin Tan. Sir Alvin?
Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. All right. For my simple closing remark, I'd like to quote the American philosopher Noam Chomsky. He said that it is the responsibility of the intellectuals to speak the truth and expose the lies. What drew my attention in the first discussion was the buzzword that Dr. Teehankee used, was the word populism. Populism is as old as history is concerned, but it becomes more palatable in our modern times when this becomes a systemic and structural approach among totalitarian regimes. The accelerating attractiveness of populism is magnified and intensified with the rise of modern machinery, specifically but not exclusively in the field of media communication technology. The ascent of populism is a crucial yet critical spectacle of the post-truth phenomenon, which Father Albert also mentioned. Populism is one of the many pathological symptoms of this era. The role of emotion and affective appeal is an effective strategy to persuade people to side with him or her. Our President Rodrigo Duterte manages effectively to ascend in position applying the populist strategy and perception of power by imitating the following behaviors which are typically manifested among Filipino as machismo attitude to convince the general herd his oneness with their pleas and sentiments. In the first section of the talk, I also would like to make a brief comparison of the theory of patronage to the concept of store patronage. This concept assumes to be a result of the consumer's matching of purchasing motives and accessible shopping options. Parang sa shopping mall, yung gusto ko sabihin. However, a variety of ad hoc situational considerations, including marketing effort, lack of money and effort, joblessness, and rising interest rates impact this sharp patronage behavior. A conscious attempt is made to generate some behavior theories for retail competition and outlet typologies. In other words, like in politics, the consumers, which is the voters for this matter, will only pick the available items in the market. Persistence is the key to any political agenda. The more you advertise and sell your commodity, the greater chance you'll be selected by the consumers. In this context, any political machinery is and must be fueled by persistent marketing strategy and media exposure. In the second part of the conference, Ms. Ash highlights the dynamics, challenges, and implications of using social media technologies. Well, in this context, I think it would be crucial, and it is crucial to learn the difference between misinformation and disinformation. Misinformation is false information spread without the intention of causing harm. Disinformation is spread with the intention of spreading lies and influencing others. Misleading information in media regarding migration, climate change, and Brexit, for example, is normally classified as generally true, mostly true, false, or unverifiable. For Ms. Ash, the main goal is to train and expose young voters to a variety of voices. Technological solution is not the answer. We need educated and consensus voters. At this juncture, we are truly very grateful for your individual and collective participation in sharing your invaluable insights and wealth of knowledge on the theme Isip Boto, May Papel nga ba ang Filosofiya sa Eleksyon? This provides us with the right view and right attitude towards upcoming national and local elections. To Dr. Julio Teehankee, thank you for explaining the nature, operation, and ramifications of the idea of patronage behavior and dispelling the irrational voter's myth, rather. And to Ms. Athena Shireen Presto, thank you for sharing with us some practical tips on how to view and approach the upcoming election and its electoral process in and through the aid of modern media communication. Finally, the perpetuity of the enlightened voter and right consciousness towards voting is politically feasible if there's a continuous philosophical erudition in the history of ideas and its vestibules to human history. Conferences and seminars like this helps us to amplify our understanding of concepts, identify the wrong state of things, and expand our horizons to explain intricate theories or complexities that require insightful, reflective illumination. In other words, the dialogical spirit and communicative learning must be fostered and strengthened by philosophical illuminations. On behalf of Dr. Aguas, Dr. Macaranas, Dr. Albela, Dr. Bartolet, and all the PNPRS officers and committees, most especially to Sir Jeric, we sincerely thank you for attending this virtual conference and all those who made this event possible and successful. We hope you found it valuable and edifying. See you in our next PNPRS conference. Agyamanak, Diyos Mabalos. Maraming salamat po.
So, ayun.
Thank you very much po, Sir Alvin.
So, meron tayong iniwan na link yata for evaluation ho, and so interesado maging member ho ng PNPRS, check na lang po yung live chat sa YouTube.
At saka sa Facebook po.
And, so, Ma'am Glove, napaka-insightful na araw na ito, and sana ho you could join us again sa mga future events ho ng PNPRS pati ng Isip Boto.
Yes po, maraming salamat once again. May marami pa pong susunod kagaya ng sinasabi ni Sir Joseph. Ayan na po. So, enjoy the rest of the day. Ingat po tayong lahat.
Ay, sa mga katanong pala ng certificate, ma'am, is pagkatapos ng evaluation, lalabas po yung certificate niya.
Yan. Importante po na matapos yung evaluation para po maibigay natin yung certificate of attendance at participation po sa ating lahat. Ayan.
Sana sa susunod, hindi na tayo online. Bumalik na tayo ulit sa actual
Yes,
conferences.
personal.
Okay, pa.
Okay po, sige
Sige po,
po.
maraming
Paalam po.
Ikaw ba si Juan o si Marites na madalas na nakatambay sa social networking sites? Ikaw ba si Juan o si Marites na hindi pa sigurado kung sino-sino ang pipiliin sa paparating na halalan? Ikaw ba si Juan o si Marites na nais malaman kung paano pumili ng iboboto sa papalapit na halalan? Kung isa ka sa mga ito, panahon na upang i-like at i-follow ang Isip Boto Mandato social media accounts dahil siguradong marami kang matututuhan at malalaman mula rito. Sa Isip Boto, tayo ay hihikayating manindigan at magnilay bago bumoto. Dito nagmula ang katagang mandato, isang mahalagang salitang nagpapahiwatig ng tungkulin natin ngayong panahon ng halalan. Kaya Isip Boto, mandato. Ano ba ang Isip Boto? Ito ay isang voters education program na nagnanais magbahagi ng mga pamantayang moral sa pagpili ng mga pinuno sa nalalapit na halalan. Nais din itong palawigin ang responsableng pagpili sa pamamagitan ng pagtuklas ng local knowledge and practices ng mga lokal na komunidad sa bansa. Dahil mahalaga ang halalan para sa sambayanan at sa ating kinabukasan, mahalaga ang pagtutulungan para sa responsableng pagtugon sa ating mandato bilang mamamayang Pilipino. Kaya Isip Boto, mandato. Ano nga ba ang layunin ng Isip Boto? Una, layunin ng Isip Boto na ipaalam sa publiko ang kahalagahan ng estado at suliranin na may kaugnayan sa halalan. Pangalawa, layunin ding ituro nito ang halaga ng halalan bilang instrumento sa pagpapatibay ng kalayaan at demokrasya. At ang ikatlo, layunin nitong hikayatin ang publiko tungo sa responsableng pagboto. Kaya Isip Boto, mandato. Ang Isip Boto ay proyekto ng Philosophical Association of the Philippines, katuwang ang ilan sa mga institusyon at professional organizations, kagaya ng Philippine Sociological Society, Philippine National Philosophical Research Society, Pambansang Samahan ng Psikolohiyang Pilipino, Lasal Institute of Governance, Union Societies of Associations of Philosophy in the Philippines, Siliman University School of Public Affairs and Governance, at St. Louis University's Department of Political and Social Sciences. Ikaw, oo ikaw, pwede ring maging bahagi nito. Kaya Isip Boto, mandato. Mahalaga ang tungkulin ng bawat Pilipino ngayong halalan. Kaya naman huwag sayangin ang pagkakataong mas matuto tungkol sa halalan sa mga serbisyong handog ng Isip Boto. Kaya kung ikaw si Juan o si Marites o isang Pilipino, babae, lalaki, LGBTQ+, indigenous o kahit saan ka man na naniniwalang dapat manindigan ngayong halalan, i-like o i-follow mo na ang aming social media accounts. Pagsikapan nating matuto ang lahat na manindigan at magnilay bago bumoto. Kaya Isip Boto, mandato.